Valen, Guardians of Hades romance series, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 1. Whoever she wasn't being subtle. Valen had first noticed her when he had stepped out of his apartment building and into a nearby square right in the heart of Rome, and a jolt had run through him, a hot bolt of electricity that had lit up his senses until they had been singing a symphony, a cantata all about his little assassin tale. Gods, had he missed her? After his brothers Ares and Diamond had sent a message to their enemy by cutting down the demon known as Trickster, everything had fallen quiet rather than imploding as Valen had been hoping. He had bet his left bollock to his eldest brother Karis that the death of one of their ranks would draw the rest of them out of hiding, allowing him and his brothers to see just how many they were dealing with, as the calamity the Morai had foreseen centuries ago finally kicked into action. The dumb bastards had done the opposite, showing just what weak-spined, pathetic, limp-fucking wastes of blood and bone they were. Fuck. Valen had wanted a fight, had craved war with every drop of blood in his body, so fiercely that it had taken him weeks of hunting and dispatching demons in Rome to finally find some balance again and master his power. Electricity arced across his fingertips, illuminating his hands as he strolled across the long square towards a narrow road at the southern end of Piazza Navona, luring his little friend with him. His thoughts returned to her, senses honing in on her location, easily pinpointing her despite the masses of mortals that moved around the popular tourist attraction, milling around the illuminated fountains and snapping photographs of each other in front of the elegant buildings, all of them taking advantage of the more clement weather as spring finally showed the first signs of warming up the city. The tiny bolts of lightning that leaped between his fingertips chased upwards and burrowed into his skin beneath his long black cotton coat, and his eyelids slid to half-mast as warmth suffused his flesh and sank deep into his bones. Sweet gods, it felt good. Always did, always would. He let his power flow through him, coaxing it to chase along his skin just beneath the surface, cajoling it into doing his bidding in order to have that momentary high, that sweet, sweet buzz that he had come to crave ever since he had been banished to this fucking hellhole known as Earth, kicked from his home in the Underworld by his father. All because of the motherfucking Morai. He turned his head to his right and spat on the worn stone paving slabs. The Morai would know it was aimed at their ugly bitch faces. The lightning dancing just below the surface of his skin grew in intensity, until it lit up every nerve ending and became the one who coaxed him, cajoled him into surrendering to it. He wanted to. Gods, did he want to. Fucking Karis and his other brothers would come down on his head if he let loose around so many mortals, though. Hell, they would tear him a new one if he so much as stepped in front of a human, teleporting away and leaving a vapor trail of darkness behind him. Some bullshit about not being allowed to reveal there were such things as gods. Valen snorted, not quite a laugh, but as close as he ever came to one, as if he had ever given a damn about the rules. His steps slowed at the junction in the road, and he stopped without realizing it, arrested by his own thought. Rules? He snorted again. Maybe he did give a fuck about those. Hell, he wasn't turning his tail into mincemeat in front of all the petty little mortals now, was he? Rules were the only reason he hadn't killed her yet, making an example of her to whoever had sent her to kill him. Weren't they? She drew closer, and he turned his head to his right, until the scar down the left side of his neck and jaw pulled tight and irritated the fuck out of him. He felt her still and then slink deeper into the shadows of the buildings, attempting to blend in with a group of mortals. Good luck with that. She couldn't hide from him. He slid his right hand inside his long black coat and shuddered as his fingers found the cool metal of his black blade, and tiny sparks of electricity leaped from their tips to the knife, warming it beneath his touch. He had been aware of her the moment she had stepped from the shadows to follow him, had been leading her on a dance all night without her knowing it. She had tailed him all across the city and into his favorite nightclub, Heavenly Body. He had pretended to chat to the women there, and a few of the men, but the whole time his focus had been on her, where she had sat in a dark corner of the bar, her face in shadow as she spoke with two men, acting as if she had gone there to meet them. His little assassin probably thought he was unaware of her, blind to her dogging his every step. She was good, but not that good. In the short time he had been aware of her tailing him, before she had disappeared on him for 3 long months, he had grown attuned to her, as if she had burrowed beneath his skin just like his lightning to become a part of him in a way. It was the only way he could explain how he reacted to her without truly being aware of her. He was always watching for her even when he didn't know it. He didn't need to put his mind to it at all now, not as he had at first. No. Awareness of her was constant, permanent. She was branded on him, stamped on his black soul. He knew the moment she was near him because she lit up his veins as fiercely as his lightning and made his body buzz just as addictively. Gods, he had missed her. Karis would call him sick if he knew, but Valen didn't give a fuck what his brother thought. He didn't give a fuck what any of them thought, and he hadn't for a long time. Not since they had stopped giving a shit about him. Valen shoved his arsehole brothers out of his head and focused on her where she lingered in the shadows, until she was all that he knew. Whoever she was human, a little mortal. No trace of demon in her. Did she know what she had gotten herself into, or was she oblivious to what he was? A god. He wanted to turn around and ask her, but then the game would be over, and where was the fun in that? Someone had hired her to kill him. He had zero doubt that she was a professional, and she was probably very good at her job when her target was a lowly human, without his heightened senses or abilities. Had she been hired by the same people who had sent a demon to take down his brother Ares' gate to the Underworld in New York? He would find out soon enough. He moved on, taking the road to his left and then banking right, and smiled when he sensed her following. He crossed the small square in front of the church and glanced at the ice cream parlor that was closing up for the night, the elderly owner bringing his signs into the shop. It was tempting to stop for a gelato and see what she would do. The weather hadn't been nice enough for ice cream, but now the cold, crisp morning air often gave way to a warm afternoon, and that heat bled into the evening before the cold stole in again. It was almost gelato weather. God bless the Italians. They knew how to cook. Gelato, pasta, pizza, and desserts. They made the best damn food. He glanced at the ice cream parlor again, sorely tempted to grab a cup to go, but managed to resist. Once he was done playing with his little assassin, he would find somewhere to indulge his new craving. That was the other thing he loved about Rome. The clocks were striking midnight around him, but he knew without a doubt he would be able to find somewhere to eat well into the morning hours. Valen forced himself to move on, taking the next right and then banking left, heading down a narrow street between the old buildings, leading his tail onwards to their final destination. The streets were growing quiet now. By the time he reached where he was heading, they would be in that strange period of emptiness between the tourists heading to bed and the clubs kicking everyone out. What would his little assassin do then? The corners of his mouth quirked. He really wanted to know. He headed left again down another narrow street, slowing his pace to allow time for the square ahead to empty. He could see it just in the distance, the rear of the circular building still illuminated by yellow light. Beyond that, the huge open square would be quiet, the restaurants and cafes closed for the night. They would be alone. Electricity coursed through him at just the thought, sending a pleasant hot shiver over his skin. He wanted to pick up the pace, wanted to reach the square and finally meet his little assassin, but somehow kept his steps slow and measured, the thought of arriving there and not finding the piazza empty because he had rushed tempering his urgent need. He didn't want this moment spoiled. He wanted it perfect. His mother's words rang in his mind, a warning she had issued when she had visited him months ago. "She is a storm born of the earth, bearing the name of an angel but the skill of a devil." Gods, how many days since he had heard those words had he lain awake thinking about them, thinking about her? He was sure his mother hadn't meant to make the assassin sound alluring, hadn't meant to weave an image of her that teased his imagination. But she had, and he hadn't been able to stop thinking about her since that day. It had been hell when she had disappeared. At first, he had been convinced it would be only a day or maybe two without her familiar presence in his life, as he patrolled Rome's streets. When she hadn't shown up after 3, he had told himself it would be only a week, and then 2 weeks, then a month. 3 had passed. Now part of him wanted to confront her and ask her where the fuck she had gone. How the fuck could she leave him alone for so long? He snorted at that, this one filled with self-contempt. Idiot. She was an assassin. He was nothing to her. A mark, a contract, a payday. That was all he was, and it was stupid of him to think any differently. It was foolish to let her sink this deep into his skin, burrow this far into his black soul. He had learned his lesson about what happened when he succumbed to such behavior long ago, had even vowed that it would never happen again. Yet here he was, casually strolling down the slope into the Piazza della Rotonda, following the graceful curved side of the Pantheon, being a fucking fool all over again. Valen closed his eyes, gritted his teeth, and shut down that weak part of himself, slamming the door shut on it and locking it back inside where it belonged. When he opened his eyes again, he was passing the 3 rows of thick towering Corinthian columns that supported the triangular pediment at the front of the Pantheon. He cast his gaze over them as he walked around towards the front of the ancient building, acting absorbed in their majesty even as his senses shifted back to his assassin. She had slowed, lingering in the shadows again, hiding from him. He would know her face. She would know his. It was the last thing she would see. He pulled the 2 sides of his long black cotton coat back, flashing the gold lining that matched his eyes, and jammed his hands into the pockets of his equally dark combat trousers, careful to keep his blades hidden from the few stray tourists that were leaving the square. Their paces quickened as they caught sight of him, their eyes darting to his scar and widening before they leaped away, and their owner hurried in the opposite direction to him. He had that effect on people. Valen shrugged it off and stopped in front of the fountain in the center of the quiet square. He scanned the old shuttered buildings that surrounded him, feigning interest in their pale blue, terracotta orange and cream facades, as he made sure he was alone with his little assassin now. The last of the tourists slinked away into a side street, and he waited until his senses said they were far away before turning around, resting his backside against the curved marble base of the fountain, and staring at the columned facade of the Pantheon. He sighed. It was beautiful, and older than he was. That was the greatest thing about Rome. Most of it had been stuck on earth for longer than him, and half of it outstripped his tender 844 years in age by at least 1,000 more. The crowded city center overflowed with such places, a mixture of old Roman buildings and ancient sites dedicated to a pantheon of pathetic gods. Movement to his right snagged his attention, and he dodged left and frowned as something zipped past his head and splashed down in the water behind him. He glanced over his shoulder at it, and his frown hardened, his lips flattening as he spotted the small feathered dart sitting in the bottom of the fountain. What the fuck? No. No way she was going to try and drug him from a distance when he had lured her to this square in order to finally come face to face with her and find out what she wanted. No way in the fucking underworld was he about to let that happen. His golden eyes snapped to the little assassin where she lingered in the shadows of a small side street to the right of the Pantheon. He caught a flash of something metal and threw himself forwards into a roll across the cobblestones as his senses blared a warning. Another dart zipped past him, and he growled through clenched teeth as he came onto his feet into a dead run at her. He sensed her alarm, heard the spike in her heartbeat as she hastily reloaded the dart gun. She fired again, and he dodged each bolt with ease, ducking beneath the first and sidestepping to evade the second, closing in on her the whole time. The gun shook in her hands as she was forced to reload again. His right hand went to the curved black blade sheathed against his hip, and he did the one thing sure to piss his brothers off if they heard about it. He stepped. Darkness embraced him, cool and comforting, and then the lingering warmth of spring in Rome met him again as he emerged from the teleport, right in front of his little assassin. Her gasp was sweet music to his ears as he introduced her throat to his blade and she froze in place. A second later, she recovered, raising her gun and aiming it at his stomach. Valen clucked his tongue, grabbed the gun with his left hand, and twisted it out of her grip, earning another delicious gasp from her. He curled his lip at the weapon and tossed it away from him, not bothering to look where it landed as it clattered across the dark gray cobblestones. His little assassin had the whole of his attention. Luminous blue eyes like tropical waters stared up into his, wide and beguiling, surrounded by dark makeup that accentuated their striking color and framed by long black lashes. Crimson full lips parted to reveal straight white teeth and the tempting hint of a soft pink tongue. Short dark hair caressed her neck and swept across her forehead, streaked with blue that matched her eyes. Fuck, she was beautiful. He swallowed his pounding heart and tried to remember what the hell he was meant to be doing. His eyes dropped from her pouty red lips to the blade he had poised against her throat. That was right. He was meant to be getting answers, not getting a hard-on. He had let her have her fun with her gun. Now he was going to have his own brand of fun. My turn. He pressed the blade harder against her throat. She snarled and kicked him in the shin, her knee-high boot connecting hard with it. He was behind her before she could catch him with a second strike, and he snagged her right wrist and took her arm with him, twisting it behind her back. She whimpered as he pressed it against her leather jacket, and he barely suppressed the hot shiver that rushed through him on hearing the sound leave her lips. Sweet gods. Everything about her was sexy, sinful. His wicked little assassin. As addictive and seductive as his power, everything he had dreamed she would be and feared she wouldn't. Valen released her wrist and stepped closer to her so their bodies touched, and his breathing quickened at the same time as hers. He swallowed hard, desperate to wet his throat, and lowered his eyes to the smooth curve of her throat and the sharp edge of his black knife. So provocative, so tempting. An ache started deep in his belly, a hunger that was always there, lurking and waiting, born of darkness. He moved the blade closer to her throat, eliciting another delicious whimper that cranked up that hunger, made it fiercer, gave it substance and strength. He could easily kill her. Part of him wanted to do it. He traced a finger down her neck, shuddered in time with her as his lightning crackled between them, energy that lit him up and pulled him deeper into his power's seductive embrace. She trembled in his arms, her head tipping up so the back of it brushed his chest. Such a petite little thing. He wanted to drop the blade and fist his hand in that silken black and blue hair of hers, wanted to hold her head back while he introduced her to all the ways his power could pain her, or pleasure her. He barely bit back the groan that rumbled up his throat at that thought, but he didn't quite manage to steady his thundering heart and quiet the trembling in his limbs. His golden eyes slid to her face, to her lips. Kill her. Or kiss her. She tensed and he clucked his tongue again, chastising her for thinking about making a move to break free of him. She had brought this upon herself. She should have stayed away, but she hadn't. She had walked back into his life and she had tried to drug him. He looked down to his left, to the gun that lay on the cobblestones a short distance away, and the hunger coursing through his blood transformed from a need to kiss her to a need to kill her. Electricity arced from his fingertips and she gasped and jolted backwards, pressing harder against his body. He growled into her ear and traced his hand over her arm, feeling the leather of her short black jacket, heating it with his power as it tried to insulate her from it. The way she trembled and shook in his arms said it wasn't doing a good enough job. If you answer me honestly, I won't kill you. A lie, but she didn't need to know that. He skimmed his hand over her stomach, smiled as he felt the unmistakable outline of more weapons beneath her leather jacket. He lifted his hand and she tensed as he found the tag of the zipper by her throat and started to pull it down. Another whimper escaped her. This one sounded distinctly unlike fear. He had bedded enough females to be able to distinguish the sounds of fear from pleasure, and the noise his little assassin had just made sat firmly in the latter's range. Valen slowed, easing the zipper down, his eyes falling to the smooth, pale mounds of her cleavage as he exposed it to the cooling night air. The dark halter top she wore cut low, revealing far too much skin. He frowned, wanted to growl at the thought of her parading around like this, on show for every wretched male out there. Fool. He shoved that stupid need out of his head and focused back on his task, rougher now as he tore at the zipper and opened her jacket. He took her other gun from the holster beneath her right arm and tossed it across the square. A knife followed it. She wriggled as he patted her down, his blade still hovering close to her throat. When he reached her thighs, she stilled, and the scent of desire on her was unmistakable. It called to his own need, ratcheting it up higher, and he slowly rose behind her, his eyes locking on her lips again. Kiss her. Or kill her. She wanted him. He snorted at that, the sensible part of his brain still functioning despite the lack of blood flowing to it. She had probably been getting off with someone in that dark corner of the nightclub. Answer me honestly. He husked into her ear, and she trembled. Such a beautiful reaction. She nodded. You don't want to die. He wasn't sure why he had to ask that, but he needed it out there. He needed to know it. A shake. It was careful, restrained. She swallowed, her throat working slowly against his blade. She didn't want to die. Kill her. Or kiss her. He spun her to face him. Her wide eyes leaped to his, and he saw himself reflected in them. Saw black eyes staring back at him. Evil. Darkness incarnate. Just like his fucking father. Only this darkness emerged for one reason and one reason only. It was born of the hunger to hurt and the terrible need to unleash his power. He would, but not on her. She didn't want to die. He smoothed his left hand over her cheek and stared down into her beguiling eyes, losing himself in their tranquil blue depths. The hunger to kill her battled the need to kiss her, to know how soft those rosy lips were and how she would taste. He lowered his eyes to her mouth, lost himself there too. As he entertained the thought of kissing her, and imagined the myriad of ways she would respond, the hold his power had over him waned, and the urge to kill faded with it. He breathed out slowly, wondering if she was aware just how close she had come to seeing the blessed Isles tonight, sent there by his hand and his blade. "Who sent you to kill me?" he whispered, eyes still fixed on her cherry-red lips, and a new ache started. A need to hear her voice, to complete the picture of his little assassin. "I got a call," she said, her voice unsteady at first, but then it gained strength, confidence, sexy, alluring confidence. "I don't know anything about them." There was bite in her words, delivered wonderfully by her thick Italian accent. A local, then. She sounded Roman right down to the way she could curse at him without saying the words. He shifted his hand against her face, and her blue eyes slipped closed for a heartbeat before they snapped open again. The way her pupils dilated almost fooled him into believing she felt something when he touched her. Something other than disgust. Fool. Fucking idiot. She was an assassin. It was all an act. A lie as much as her words had been. She was trying to play him to make sure he didn't kill her, all so she could kill him. He pressed the knife harder against her throat, so it nicked her golden skin, and she gasped, a friendly reminder that he was the one with the blade and the one who decided her fate. No amount of her acting would change that. She could fuck him, and he would still be the one in control. "Give them a message." He leaned down towards her, so she had to tip her head back to keep her eyes on his, and was aware of just who had the power in this relationship. She nodded. "If they want to kill me, send someone more competent." He stepped to the roof of the Pantheon and crouched in the darkness, wrapped in shadows as he sheathed his blade and watched her. She turned in circles in the square below, her eyes darting around. Who was she? He flexed the fingers of his left hand. The feel of her was branded on them, impossible to forget. Soft skin, warm, pulse ticking steadily, trembling. The sight of her was branded on his black soul. Calm blue eyes, crimson lips, wild black and blue hair, a body made for sin. And the way her eyes had flashed in that moment before he had teleported. Anger. Sweet gods, he bet she had a temper to match his own. He was counting on it. His words had insulted her, and she had looked ready to fight him, despite the fact he had a blade and she had been unarmed. His gaze tracked her as she gathered her things, including the spent darts, clearing away all the evidence. A strange hot sensation went through him, and his head snapped around to his right, eyes leaping south over his shoulder towards the gate to the Underworld. Bastards could wait. He looked back down into the square and frowned, the heat within him giving way to cold. His little assassin was leaving. He rose onto his feet and lifted his left hand to his face, breathed in the lingering scent of her on his skin, and smiled as he watched her go. The second she was out of sight, he teleported to the Rome gate, heading in the opposite direction to her. He didn't need to worry, and he didn't need the bastard Morai to tell him he would see her again. He had made sure of that himself. He had set fire to her temper, had issued her a challenge, and she would take him up on it. She would come at him with guns blazing. Valen grinned as he appeared at the gate. Bring it on. Chapter 2. Stronzo. Ava idly rubbed her right thumb across the front of her throat as she sat at the grotty bar of Heavenly Body, head pounding from the music, and eyes constantly scanning everyone who moved around the dimly lit basement nightclub. She hadn't seen him in 2 nights. Her body tingled with the memory of the way his hand had roamed over her, skillfully plucking her weapons from her, somehow making it seem sensual and seductive, when she should have found it alarming, disturbing, threatening. She muttered another ripe curse, aimed it at him with all the venom she could manage. 2 nights, and she couldn't get him out of her mind. Sure, it was her job to think about him, to get every scrap of information she could on him. Or at least that had been her job. What was meant to have been a simple intel-gathering mission had somehow turned into something else a week ago, when her client had called her again out of the blue and told her she wasn't done. He wanted her to drug him. That unsettled her now as much as it had then, playing on her mind as badly as the man who was her target. Why had her client changed the mission parameters? It didn't bother her on a professional level. It wasn't the first time she had been hired to kill someone, after all. Years as a hired weapon had taught her to keep herself emotionally detached from her marks and what she was doing. So why didn't she feel emotionally detached this time? She had done everything by the book, hadn't strayed from the rules she set out for herself. Yet something about her mark had stirred dangerous feelings in her. Her eyes slipped shut as an image of him that night played out in her mind, a broken replay of him gracefully dodging every bolt from her dart gun, and suddenly appearing before her, towering over her with a slight tilt to his lips, that had spoken of amusement rather than fear or fury. He had been toying with her. It grated on her last nerve, fraying it more than it already had been, rousing the same potent burst of anger she had felt when he had dared to insult her by insinuating she wasn't a good enough assassin to take his arse down. Stronzo, she muttered as she looked down at her shot glass, watching the colorful lights that rotated above her dancing across it and her hands, and reflecting off the wet rings left behind on the black counter by the other patrons of the club when they took their drinks with them to their corners of the busy room. She lifted it to her lips and downed the vodka in one. The bartender smiled at her as he stopped in front of her, snagging her attention. His dark eyes twinkled with his amusement, and an image of the man flashed over him, a vision of the way he had smiled at her. Who the fuck was he? She had done her best to gather information on him, had asked around at every place she had seen him over the 2 months she had been tailing him in Rome, and had even continued trying to find out more about him in the 3 her client had pulled her off the job, Nothing she had heard had even hinted at him being skilled in fighting, and the way he had moved and the blade he had stuck against her damn throat pointed towards him being in her line of work. Another assassin. Was it possible? Did her client know what he was? Ava saw another flash of the way he had moved like lightning across the square, sat by the fountain admiring the Pantheon 1 second, and right in front of her the next. Her heart pounded as it had that night, galloping in her chest, flooding her veins with adrenaline as her fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. She should have known he was dangerous. He had the look of a killer, so why not the skills to go with it? She grunted in frustration and clawed her fingers through her short hair, pulling the blue-streaked black strands away from her face. The bartender slid her another shot and said something she ignored. He had been hitting on her the past few nights, a new addition to the usual crew who served at Heavenly Body. And while he was handsome, and ripped, judging by the way his standard-issue white shirt hugged his powerful body, she just wasn't interested in him. Her mark flashed across her mind again, standing in the open square with his hands jammed into the pockets of his black combat trousers, in a way that pulled them tight across muscular thighs and drew his coat back to reveal a black t-shirt that sat like a second skin over a torso packed with honed muscles. She shivered as she remembered how that body had felt pressed against her back as his blade sat poised against her throat. Hard, hot. Ava screwed her eyes shut and downed the shot of vodka, hoping to kill whatever part of her brain had become fixated on him since that night. He was dangerous. The darkness that had been in his eyes when she had faced him, she had never seen anything like it. It was as if his golden eyes had turned black as night. It must have been a trick of the light, because they had been gold again when he had lifted his face enough for the street lamps to shine down on it. Another hot shiver racked her, heating her blood with the memory of his hand against her face this time. That heat turned to the flames of anger as his lips moved, spewing an insult that stoked the fire inside her and had her itching for a rematch, even when she wasn't sure she would win. But she was damned if she was going to allow a man to degrade her like that, making out she was useless, incompetent, not worth their time. Ava slammed the empty glass down on the tacky bar top with enough force to make the man next to her jump out of his skin. She ignored his comments as she pushed away from the bar and slid off her stool and clawed her way through the heavy Saturday night crowd, heading for the exit. He wasn't coming. Now he was wasting her time. She pushed her way up the steps and shoved the metal door at the top open. Cool swept over her and she breathed deep of the crisp night air, using it to soothe her anger and wash it away. Just as she had found some calm again, the sound of her phone ringing broke the silence. It buzzed in the back pocket of her black jeans, sending vibrations down her right leg. She snatched it and frowned at the screen. Damn. Her client. Not what she needed tonight. Ava debated not answering it, even when she knew it wasn't an option or a path she wanted to take. She'd only had a few meetings with the man, but he had given her the impression right from the moment she had met him that he wasn't the sort of person you disappointed and lived to tell the tale. That was the only reason she had agreed to drug the mark when her client had called and acted as if he had never told her she had done her job and the contract was fulfilled. She swiped her thumb across the screen to answer it and lifted it to her ear. "We need to meet." Her client's deep voice rang through the speaker before she could even utter a greeting, his tone brooking no argument, a demand, not a request. She was sick of hearing that tone coming from a man. He was the same as the rest of them, thinking that because he had hired her, he owned her arse. "Come to the villa immediately." He hung up. Ava lowered the phone and scowled at it. Stronzo. The king of them. But it seemed he was also the king of her until he decided to release her from his rule. And that meant she was going to have to drive all the way out into the countryside to his villa just to see what the fuck he wanted at such an ungodly hour of the morning. She huffed and pocketed her phone, placing it in the inside one of her leather jacket this time. She zipped the black leather up as she walked, following the maze of narrow streets back to where she had parked her scooter, and tried not to think about how her body had lit up when her mark had dared to frisk her for weapons. When she reached the small black and silver Vespa, she looked along the wider street in both directions, scanning the parked cars and the few people moving around it. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but the hairs on the back of her neck had suddenly stood on end, and for a ridiculous moment, she had been sure someone was watching her. She brushed it off and unlocked the chain on her scooter and dumped it into the storage beneath the seat. She pulled her helmet out of the same box and tugged it on, fastening it beneath her chin, and slung her leg over the bike. A shiver raced through her, and she paused with her hand on the ignition key. Looked around again. No one was on the street now. No one was watching her. She inhaled and blew out her breath. She was just being jumpy. The combination of her client's call and waiting for her mark to leap out of the shadows and kill her had made her jittery. She started the engine, switched on the lights, kicked up the stand, and pulled out onto the empty road. The weird sensation faded as she sped through the streets of her beloved city, leaving the center behind and heading for the outskirts. Bright street lamps soon gave way to total darkness as she hit open roads. The warmth of the city gave way to cold at the same time, and she huddled down into her jacket as the chilly night air sapped the heat from her bare hands and face. Ava kept her focus locked on the road ahead of her, following it as it snaked through dark countryside, her Vespa struggling over the hills that surrounded Rome. She should have brought one of her cars out with her tonight, but it was easier navigating the small streets of Rome on a scooter. She looked across at the city as she reached the top of one of the hills and rounded a bend. It sparkled below her, a warm sea of stars in the night. She always had loved the view of the city from up in the hills. It looked so peaceful even when she knew it was far from quiet. Even in the dead of winter, the tourists flocked to Rome, lured by its magic, its beauty, and its history. The Eternal City. The road twisted again, and she reluctantly turned her back on the city and lost track of time as she drove, passing small villages and long cypress tree-lined driveways that led down to farms and villas. She slowed as she neared the tree-lined avenue that would take her up another steep hill to her client's enormous 3-story mansion, and caught a glimpse of the illuminated palatial yellow ochre building in the distance as she turned into the driveway. She hated this place. Even at night, it reminded her of her old home, the one she had lived in before turning her back on her family. Ava pushed those memories to the back of her mind as she approached the villa. The 2 men dressed in black patrol fatigues at the gate nodded as she slowed her scooter and passed them. Whoever her client was, he took his security very seriously. Every time she had come to the villa, she had seen at least 2 men on the gate and another 4 in the grounds, and further men inside, all armed. She parked her Vespa beside a black Lamborghini and kicked the stand down as she switched off the engine. As she dismounted, she shoved her keys into her jacket pocket, keeping them close at hand in case she needed them. She was armed beneath her leather, but a quick escape was preferable to a shootout if things went badly. There was no way she could outgun so many men, not even if she could get her hands on a few of their weapons. The golden gravel of the driveway crunched under her knee-high black boots as she walked, removing her helmet as she approached the grand villa from its side, her eyes leaping over the rows of windows, skipping the ones that glowed with golden light and focusing on the unlit ones. She caught movement in some of them. She was being watched from all angles. Her client was always this cautious, even with her. It seemed he had serious trust issues. Or he was waiting for someone to launch an assault on him. She could easily imagine there were people out there who wanted him dead, rivals who wouldn't think twice about attacking him at his stronghold. The gravel gave way to sandstone slabs as she entered the enormous patio that spanned the long facade of the grand house, edged with a delicate stone balustrade to her right, where the hill dropped off and the view was stunning even in the darkness. Rome shimmered in the distance, a golden glow that illuminated the night sky and challenged the stars. She dragged her eyes away from it, focusing back on her destination. The elegant columned porch jutted out from the building, perfectly manicured topiary framing it and making it look like any other Italian mansion, when it wasn't anything like the innocent family homes or farmhouses in the area. A killer lived here. She was as certain of it as she was her name was Ava. Killers recognized their own kind. She stepped past the man on the door and into the bright foyer of the villa. Light danced around the room from the crystal and gold chandelier, reflecting off the white marble floor and pale yellow walls. Her heartbeat ticked up, and she drew in a slow, secret breath to steady it as another man watched her closely, unwilling to let him see her nerves. What the hell had she gotten herself into? She should have been suspicious of her client from the start. Would have been if she had first met him here rather than a public location in the city. With so many men in his employment, he hardly needed her to spy on his target, and he definitely didn't need her to drug him or kill him, or whatever the fuck she was meant to be doing to him now. Something was wrong with this whole situation, something that set her on edge and had her wishing she had unzipped her coat and unclipped her gun. The security guard narrowed his eyes on her, and she shot him a smile as she casually swept her fingers through her blue-streaked hair, neatening her appearance, hoping the man would think fixing it so she looked good for his boss was the only reason she hadn't moved from the foyer. When the man raked his dark eyes over her, a slight smile tilting his broad lips, she flashed him a wink and sauntered towards the two staircases that curved elegantly upwards to the first floor, a little swing in her hips to keep him off guard. She looked back at him as she walked between two staircases and took a right, heading beneath them. The guy grinned at her, practically slobbering as he stared at her arse in her tight jeans. He disappeared from view as she hit the corridor, and her walk lost all swagger and turned all business, her expression following suit. Her blue eyes fixed on the wooden door at the end of the long pale green corridor. She would smile for the bastard on the other side, would play her role as his obedient assassin to perfection to appease him, but the whole time she would be on alert, because she had quickly learned he wasn't the sort of man you let your guard down around. She had swum with sharks, had worked for the worst of Italy's underground bosses, but she had never met a shark like her client. He ate the other sharks for breakfast. The door opened a second before she reached it, swinging back to reveal an enormous black-walled office with a pale gray marble floor, and the biggest ebony desk she had ever seen in the center of it. Leaning against that desk, dressed in a crisp black suit with a white shirt opened at the collar to reveal a hint of defined muscles, was what she could only describe as a man most women would call sex on legs. Blush-pink full lips curved a little as his stunning emerald-green eyes met hers, and he pushed onto his feet, coming to stand at least 6'6" in front of her. The tailored suit hugged his trim figure to perfection, accentuating every curve, and sure, she wasn't immune to his charms, no matter how fiercely she tried to be. She prepared herself every time she was about to face him, shut down every feeling and locked them in place, putting herself firmly in control of her emotions. Yet every time he turned that smile on her, those feelings broke her hold and defied her. "My angel," he said, the smile curving his sinful lips reflected in the deep baritone of his voice. A voice made for melting panties. She hated it when he called her that. In the underground world, she was the angel. She was not his. She cleared her throat, wishing she could clear her head just as easily, and nodded. "Signor Benares?" His smile grew wider, and he shoved long tanned fingers through his wild sun-kissed blonde locks, something he always did whenever she called him that, as if her tacking on an honorific set him on edge for some reason. "Just Benares, my dear." Another panty-melting factor about her client. The guy was British and said everything with a regal edge that she was sure many women would find seductive. Ava was too busy pondering his words to be affected by the manner of their delivery and his accent. She had tried at least twice to get him to expand on why he was just Benares. Like he had no other name? Her Italian stock had shackled her with around 1,000,000 names, so the thought of someone only having one was completely foreign and ridiculous to her. He merely smiled if she asked, so she had given up. She yawned, hoping to make a point about the hour without saying it, and he leaned back against the ebony desk, canting his head as he raked those jewel-green eyes over her. "Tired, my dear?" She wished he wouldn't call her that, as if she belonged to him. My angel, my dear. It made her skin crawl. Ava rolled her right shoulder, gunning for casual. It's been a late few nights. Since you failed? A female voice echoed around the room, a sharp snap to the British accent that was at odds with her client's more melodic one. Ava frowned at the blonde woman as she sashayed around the desk to her client's right, a short black dress hugging her incredible figure, and tall stiletto heels making her already long, lean legs look even longer. A sleek fall of golden hair cascaded around her shoulders and down to the small of her back, and eyes the color of summer skies locked on Benares. Beautiful didn't seem a good enough word to describe her. Ava was sure that if this woman walked around in Rome, every red-blooded male would be following her, calling after her and wanting her. No man on the planet could be in the same room as her and not be affected. Ava glanced at Benares. His eyes hadn't left her. The blonde's blue eyes didn't stray from him. They held an expectant edge, one Ava could easily read. She wanted Benares to look at her. When she halted close to him and his eyes still remained on Ava, her beautiful face darkened, her rosy, pouty lips compressing into a vicious line and fine eyebrows dipping low. Ava had never met the woman before, but the way she looked at Benares, then turned that black scowl on Ava, left her with the impression that she was something to her client, and she didn't appreciate the way he was looking at Ava. A lover? Jinn, Benares whispered softly, tenderness in it, and the woman looked back at him. He still didn't take his eyes off Ava, not even when he shot his right hand out and grasped the woman called Jinn by her throat. She gasped and bit her lip, as if his touch had been one of pleasure, not violence, and looked as if she might melt into a puddle at his feet as he hauled her towards him, causing her to bump against the desk. He turned his face towards her, bringing his lips close to her cheek, but his eyes still remained locked onto Ava's. Temper. He shoved Jinn backwards away from him, and she stumbled a few steps before catching herself and glaring at him. Jinn turned that glare on her. You failed. Ava held her ground and glanced at Benares, wanting to see his opinion on what had happened, hoping that she hadn't made a grave mistake by driving to a very private estate in the middle of a huge tract of land in the dead of night. It wasn't going to end here. Now. She told herself that on repeat, even as she took stock of all the possible exits in the room and recounted every escape route she had planned without taking her eyes off Benares. The blonde's face darkened again, and she took a hard step forwards towards Ava. It caught Ava's attention, but not his. His green eyes remained firmly rooted on her, perusing her from head to toe at a leisurely pace as Jinn took control of the meeting. Ava wasn't sure what the hell their relationship was, but she wished he would stop looking at her as if she was someone he wanted to bed, because the more he stared at her with interest in his eyes, the darker Jinn's mood turned, and the more the woman looked as if she was considering killing her. It seemed Benares wasn't the only shark she was swimming with this time. Jinn was in on the plan, client number 2, and Ava had the sinking feeling that disappointing her would result in the same bloody end as disappointing Benares. Death. She knew that the game she played was dangerous, had always been aware of it and the fact that every job might be her last, but it was all she knew. It was her life, and she didn't know how to live it any other way now. She had stepped out of the light and into the darkness, and there was no going back. There was only going forwards. Failure was not an option, Jinn snarled, flashing straight white teeth, and her blue eyes seemed to brighten with her fury. Perhaps if you had given me all the information you already had on him, I wouldn't have failed, Ava shot back, maintaining the behavior Benares would expect from her from all their meetings and telephone calls. She wasn't meek. She was dangerous, took no prisoners, and certainly didn't let anyone push her around. She was an assassin, and she was damned good at what she did. Although she wished she had chosen to add a little meekness when she had decided what sort of personality she was going to have with him. A dash of meek might have gone some way towards placating Jinn at the very least. Although the heated look in Benares' eyes said that he liked the headstrong, sassy, and hot-blooded personality she had chosen, that was much closer to her own real one. Ava squared her shoulders, planted her hands on her hips, and glared at both Jinn and Benares. Maybe if you had mentioned that he had skills, the same skill set that I have, I would have been prepared. Benares casually rested his hands on the desk on either side of his hips. True. So he had known that her Mark was a killer, an assassin. Stronzo. She wanted to throttle him for that, even when she knew it would be suicide. We will give you a second chance, he said, and the look Jin shot him conveyed everything Ava needed to know. That hadn't been the plan. Benares had called her all the way out to the secluded villa in order to kill her. What had changed his mind? He raked his eyes over her again, a slow slide from head to toe and back again, and smiled when his emerald green gaze met hers. Jin continued to glare at him, looking for all the world as if she was also considering throttling him. You fought him, Benares said, his smile holding. You survived. I'm sure you could do it again. He raised his right hand, and Jin obediently strutted to the other side of the desk and squatted there. She opened a cupboard, closed it, and rose back onto her feet. Ava frowned at the 7-inch-long black rectangular case she held in her hands. A weapon? Ava tensed, preparing herself. Benares sighed. Always so distrustful. That is the problem with your breed. He held his hand out to Jin, but rather than taking the case from her, he motioned for her to give it to Ava. The woman approached her, her pretty face still locked in a scowl, one that screamed of anger at Benares and jealousy. Again, his eyes remained rooted on Ava even when Jin was in his line of sight. What game was he playing? Was he trying to get his lover to kill her? She wanted to tell him to quit staring at her, but held her tongue instead and focused on the ominous black case on Jin's upturned palm as the woman held it out to her. Since you can fight him, and he does not seem interested in killing you, then you get a second chance. Benares nodded towards Jin. She bowed her head and opened the case. Ava's eyes went wide. A glass syringe sat nestled in black velvet within the box. Her gaze shot to Benares. His smile widened the smallest amount, but it didn't reach his eyes. They were cold now, impassive and diamond-hard. Do not fail again, my angel. A hypodermic needle? Was he serious? She hadn't exactly fought her Mark and survived, and the bastard knew that. He knew that the Mark had shut her down before she had even had a chance to start fighting. He knew everything, which meant he had people watching her every move. Why? Jin snapped the case shut, startling her out of her thoughts, and Ava's gaze leaped to her. It is rare. Do not squander it this time. Jin shoved the case into her hands. Ava wanted to ask what was rare, the drug she was meant to administer to her Mark or a second chance from Benares. She kept her mouth shut and clutched the case instead, heart pounding as she considered what they were asking her to do. They wanted her to drug her Mark, and this time they wanted her to do it up close and personal. No dart gun, just a syringe. Ava eyed the case. What is it anyway? She said with as much confidence as she could muster, holding on to her mask so Benares didn't see through it to the fact that she was scared, afraid of him and thinking twice about going through with his request. Running the hell away from Rome was starting to look good. She could disappear, lay low, and keep her head down somewhere remote, maybe South America. The coldness in his emerald eyes warned not to try it, that he could already see through her carefully constructed facade and knew what she was thinking, and that it wouldn't end well for her. How powerful was he? Every honed instinct she possessed said that he was too powerful, that he could easily track her down and kill her if she dared to disobey or tried to flee. A means to an end, Benares said. An end. Poison. It wasn't her style, but she was hardly in a position to say that. What the client wanted, the client got. Although she did find it strange that she had been hired to tail her Mark and learn about him, and now her client was asking her to kill him. Benares had only ever asked her to gather information, had made it sound important that she did so. Why would he want to learn about someone he meant to kill? He had made it sound as if he had been looking for a weakness he could exploit. Now he was asking her to poison him. Had something changed? Ava shut down that line of thought before it got her into trouble. She had the feeling that the less she knew, the better off she would be on this particular job. Clients were allowed to have a change of heart. She tried to shrug it off as she bowed her head and retraced her steps through the villa, but the heavy feeling in the pit of her stomach refused to go away. She had never been one for guilt before, so why did the thought of what she was going to do with the contents of the case she clutched tightly in her fingers unsettle her? She caught a flash of her Mark holding her, powerful arms caging her, his knife pressed against her throat together with his knuckles. The press of those knuckles had felt more dangerous than the blade, sending an electric thrill through her, and the way his incredible eyes had held hers, merciless and cold, but at the same time filled with a wealth of emotions just beneath their golden surface, had ignited a spark that had set her on fire. Ava put it down to the fact he had bested her, pushing aside all the other reasons she could think of for the way she had felt in his arms, desperate to remain professional and maintain her distance. It had been a long time since someone had beaten her, and that was all this feeling was. He had brought a spark of excitement back into her dull little life and had reignited something inside her, a fire she thought had died long ago. Chapter 3. Valen had somehow managed to stay away from his little assassin for 3 nights, when every shred of his being had wanted to head into Rome and track her down to finish what they had started. He wanted her to come at him guns blazing, with that fire flashing in her stunning eyes. He wanted to tangle with her. Gods, he wanted that. He shoved his fingers through his blonde hair, raking it back from his face, and gripped it hard, taking pleasure from the pain as it tugged at his scalp. His hand shook, muscles tensed and quivering, trembling with need that was becoming impossible to contain. He was hungry for another shot at her, ached with a need to hear her voice and smell her again, to feel her body plastered against his beautiful little assassin. He still wasn't sure whether he wanted to kiss her or kill her. The darker part of himself, the side ruled by his power and thirst for violence, wanted the latter. The lighter part, he wasn't sure that existed anymore, but something inside him wanted the little female in a way he had never wanted another. Centuries on this God-forsaken plane, and not once had he desired a female the way he desired her. He vaguely recalled betting some mortals at the start of his sentence, but his interest had waned as his power had grown, becoming more seductive and alluring, and pleasurable than they could ever be. His lightning had become everything he needed, both his pleasure and his pain, his joy and his despair. He wanted for nothing else, except her. Now he couldn't get his mind off her, and it was starting to become a pain. His brothers had noticed it during their last meeting the night after he had let her go, the night after she had returned to him. He had managed to blow them off, spouting bullshit about the Rome gate keeping him busy, and all the pain in his arse hellspawn that kept calling him out to it to open it for them, so they could travel between this realm and the Underworld. He had even tossed in a few demon hunting reports for good measure, ensuring his brothers had no reason to suspect anything. His brothers were pain-in-his-arse gods, always sticking their noses in where they didn't belong, and they pissed him off more than the hellspawn who dragged him to the gate at all hours of the night, as if he was their personal bitch. Valen stared at the shimmering gate to the underworld that formed a pattern of concentric rings filled with glyphs and rested flat like a disc above the ground in the middle of one of Rome's ancient sites in the Palatine Hill. Carus, his oldest brother, was the worst. Self-righteous prick. The fucker had been looking down at him for the past 5.5 centuries, always watching him as if waiting for him to fuck up again. He spat on the sand beside him. Bastard. He idly stroked the obsidian blade sheathed against his right hip beneath his long black jacket, thoughts turning dark as he imagined helping Carus out the night he had decided to cut his own throat in order to see if Ares' new plaything, Megan, really had the ability to heal. Valen would have gladly cut it for him, a little deeper than Carus had chosen. Of course, the other 5 pains in his arse would have come down on him, and even dear old Dad probably would have got in on the action, too. Fuck. Maybe even Nemesis herself, although the punishment she normally dished out to him was more pleasurable than having to spend time with his brothers. 8.5 centuries he had been putting up with his brother's bullshit. The last couple of centuries had been the worst. At least when they had been in the underworld, he had been able to keep to himself, to go away whenever they bothered him too much and roam the various realms, finding some quiet. Now he couldn't escape them. They stepped into his apartment all the fucking time, acting as if he needed a bloody babysitter. He snorted at that, but there wasn't even a hint of amusement in it this time. Not a drop. Bastards. The ground beneath his feet warmed and he looked down, frowning at the delicate green stem that pushed from the sand between his black leather boots, growing before his eyes. It formed a bud that opened to reveal a small golden flower. The light that faded as the colorful rings of the gate shrank into a yellow dot and winked out of existence. Valen stared at the flower. A message. He huffed and scuffed his boot over it, crushing the delicate bloom into the dirt, and turned his back on the gate. The ground shook in response. His father's doing. He closed his eyes and gritted his teeth, cursed himself for letting his temper get the better of him when his mother had only been trying to soothe him with the flower, a symbol of her love. He issued a silent apology to her and walked away, heading into the darkness and not bothering to send one to his father. He was 95% certain that Hades despised him as much as his brothers did. It was entirely possible that only his mother loved him. Only his mother could love him. It was safer that way anyway. He didn't believe what she had said to him 3 months ago when she had broken the rules to leave the underworld and visit him when Ares had gone moon-eyed over the mortal female Megan. Persephone was a romantic, a fool. No one could love him. The curse made sure of that. A curse he deserved. His whole fucking life was cursed and had been since that night 5.5 centuries ago. But even if he could change the events of that night, he wouldn't do it. He would rather live with a curse on his head than live without taking action against those responsible for what had happened. He reached the perimeter fence of the site and stepped, teleporting to the other side, and kept walking, heading along the road towards the center of Rome and leaving a trail of black smoke in his wake. He jammed his hands in his pockets as he walked, his gaze on the pavement, his head whirling with thoughts he did his best to ignore and shut out. Memories he wanted to forget. The familiar swirling sensation started in the pit of his stomach, a warning that demons were nearby. The coppery stench of them hit him a moment later, and he stretched his senses out far and wide, tuning into his surroundings and scouring the ruins for the filthy wretches. His internal radar pinpointed them directly ahead, near to the island that sat in a bend of the Tiber River. It seemed his knight was looking up. Most days he cursed his father for sending him to the mortal world with his brothers, but never when he was fighting demons. He lived for times like this, when he could drench his hands in their black blood and send them screaming into the afterlife. The rules of his mission clearly stated he was allowed to use any force necessary to ensure demons didn't breach the gate between the underworld and Earth. Lightning crackled between his fingertips as he withdrew his hands from his jeans pockets. Valen used all the force of the underworld at his disposal to eradicate them, never holding back even a fraction of his strength. He showed them no mercy, because they had shown the same to his family. They had attacked his parents once, and then again when Karis had been born, shaking the underworld with their impudence and forcing his father to banish them from his realm. Now, because of a future the Moirai had seen, an attack on the 8 gates that would merge the underworld and Earth to create a new realm, Hades had banished him and his brothers here to fight the demons and protect their world. Demons had fucked with his family, in too many ways to count. What they had given they would receive, eternally. He would hunt and destroy them until either they were extinct or he drew his last breath. He kicked off with his left foot and stepped, disappearing from the street near the Palatine Hill and reappearing in a small square on the island in the center of the river. The 3 demons immediately froze. They looked as human as he did, but their stench gave them away, their corrupted souls bleeding through the skin they wore. Valen slowly drew his coat back and rested his hands on the hilts of the twin black blades strapped to his hips. The female of the group tensed. The two males, both slightly older than her and appearing in their late 20s to mortal eyes, which placed them at around 70 to 100 years old, moved to shield her. How noble. He eased the blades from their sheaths and lowered them to his side as he focused on his body, on his power. The brunette male's eyes leaped down to the long black curved knives as that power flowed out of Valen on command and arced along the metal, causing flashes of light in the dimly lit square. His paler-haired companion eased back a step, his left hand fumbling behind him and finding the female. He caught her arm and pushed her back with him. Distancing themselves. Did they think he was going to let them go? Valen clucked his tongue, causing the titanium stud in the center of its tip to crack against his teeth. "Run!" the blonde hissed and shoved her hard, and she twisted as she stumbled. She found her footing and broke into a dead sprint. Valen sighed. He did hate it when they tried to run. It took the fun out of it. He idly tossed his right blade into the air above him, slipped his hand into his coat, and pulled free two small throwing knives from their holster against his ribs. Lightning danced across their surface as he poured his power into them in the split second it took for him to draw and set them loose with a casual flick of his wrist. They hit the female in her right shoulder and lower back, and she shrieked as she went down hard, her body jerking as his electricity rushed into it. The brunette looked over his shoulder at her and then back at Valen, and hissed through his teeth as Valen caught his second black blade before it hit the floor. Actually fucking hissed. Shapeshifters. Had to be. It had been a while since he had fought one. Several of the shapeshifter species had elevated themselves to the rank of hellspawn rather than demon by providing thorough charts of their bloodlines and aligning themselves with other hellspawn breeds, united under the banner of his father and pledged to protect the underworld from demons. What species of shifter were these three? Their stench said they were still demon, still corrupted and twisted by darkness. He flicked a glance at the writhing female and frowned as she alternated between mortal and demonic in appearance, sprouting horns and wings, and even a lizard-like tail as his lightning continued to ravage her body. Scaly lips peeled off rows of serrated sharp teeth, and her yellow eyes watered as she grunted and whimpered. Not a species that his father had any love for, which meant he had the green light to tear them apart. He raised his left blade and took aim, targeting the female while she was down and vulnerable. A familiar sensation went through him, and he froze. Heat warmed the space behind his breastbone, chasing out the cold calm he was used to, and not only during a fight when most warriors found themselves detached from everything, a creature of logic, not emotion. His little assassin. She would choose now to return to him. He snarled and hurled the knife at the female, but took no pleasure from her scream as his blade sank deep into her side. Damn meddling mortal. Fighting was only fun when he could use his power, and while he normally didn't give a shit what sort of chewing out his eldest brother would issue if he broke the rules, or the potential punishment handed down from on high, he found himself playing by the book, acting mortal. Because of her. He eyed his remaining two opponents. If he snuck a little lightning into his blades while fighting them, would they go batshit crazy like the female had? Valen wasn't sure whether demons revealing their existence to a mortal because of something he did was grounds for punishment. Ares had fought Trickster in front of Megan, revealing the existence of gods and demons to her in the process, and hadn't been punished. But then Megan was a carrier, a mortal with hellspawn blood in her family tree and a power of her own. Damn it. Fucking little assassin, he grumbled, and the two demons frowned at him. He shot them a glare, letting them know his words hadn't been aimed at them, and they shouldn't have been listening. Fuck, he wasn't even sure if they had been aimed at her, or his own pathetic desire not to stir the pot this time and cause trouble. A desire to fit in. What was the point in that? It wouldn't change a damned thing, and he knew it. Every fucker on the planet would still despise him because they had already made up their mind about him, and there was no way to alter it for the better. Nothing he did could redeem him now. The ground warmed beneath his feet. Valen scuffed it with his boot. Not now, mother. One of the idiot demons rushed him. They never did learn. Every demon in this world thought they could be the one to claim the glory of bringing him to his knees. Morons. He was a god. He grinned and power raced through him, lightning that warmed his bones and lit his blood. He kicked off, propelling himself right at the hapless dimwit. There was a flash of panic in his eyes, a momentary twitch as he tensed, as if regretting his actions already. And then he broke right. Valen kept running, aiming for the brunette now that his companion had cleared the way. The demon looked ready to piss in his pants, but he pulled his shit together just as Valen reached him and blocked his right blade with his forearm. Instead of the expected scream and stench of black demon blood, his blade bounced right off the bastard. Scales emerged from beneath the male's black jumper and rippled over his hand. That was cheating. Valen spun on his heel and brought his left blade around in a deadly arc, aiming it for his throat this time. The black knife struck, bounced off Scales again. Fucker. The male slammed a fist into his kidney and he grunted as he staggered forwards from the blow. Fine. Maybe these two weren't as weak as most of the demons he fought. He wasn't going to complain. It had been too long since he had been able to go all out and have a good brawl. The feel of his little assassin's eyes on him reminded him that he couldn't go all out now either. He grumbled another string of curses aimed at her and focused on his two opponents. The female was still down, leaking blood at a rate that said she wasn't going to be getting up anytime soon, if at all. The pale-haired bastard landed a blow in his stomach, and Valen knocked him back with a right uppercut of his own. He went to follow with a blow with his left blade to see whether this one could do the impenetrable Scales trick too, and the brunette grabbed him from behind, locking his arms under Valen's and restraining him. His friend grinned. Victoriously? Was he serious? This was little more than a brief inconvenience, a pause in the build-up to what was going to be a very bloody, very beautiful fight that would end in only one way, with him grinning victoriously at their corpses. Pale-haired idiot approached, cracking knuckles like some cliché out of an action movie. Valen reared back as he came within striking distance, forcing his captor to bend backwards with him and allowing him to bring his legs up. He slammed his right boot hard into the pale-haired one's skull, heard bone crack beneath the blow, and followed it with a left kick to the chest. He staggered backwards, lost his footing, and landed on his arse in the small square. Brunette struggled, a useless endeavor. Valen's boots hit the deck again, and he kicked upwards once more, propelling himself over the head of his captor. He landed behind the bastard, and the wretched worm tried to run, so Valen stuck a knife in the back of his left thigh. He screamed, somewhere between a hiss and a shriek, and limped away while fumbling with the blade. Valen wanted it back. It was one of his favorites. He kicked off again, shouldered the guy in his spine, and sent him sprawling across the flagstones, landing on top of him and tearing a pained grunt from his lips. He shoved a knee hard into the demon's back, reached over and yanked the blade free of his thigh. Another hiss scream tore through the night, and he swore his little assassin gasped from her perch in the shadows. A boot came out of nowhere, slamming into the side of Valen's head and knocking him sideways, off the brunette. He growled, his head throbbing and darkness pouring through his veins in response. It coaxed his power, drew it to the surface, and by the gods, he wanted to unleash it all on the fuckers. He wanted to make it rain lightning until only ashes remained. He raised his hand to do just that, and both demons flinched, tensing in preparation for the strike. Damn it. Unleashing enough voltage to blow his enemies to pieces would also put the assassin in danger, and he was damned if he was going to ruin his perfect track record of not harming mortals. He called his black blade to his hand, using another of his powers to rip it out of the dead female demon. It shot into his palm, and he closed his fingers around the bound leather hilt, slowly rose onto his feet and faced the two males, both of whom looked somewhere between stunned and relieved. Their lucky day. He was going to have to kill them the old-fashioned way. He reached beneath his coat and palmed another two of his throwing knives. He couldn't risk imbuing them with electricity, not with the assassin watching, but they could still do their work. They could still slow down the demons for him. All it would take was a well-aimed blow and the Moirai being nice to him for once by not letting scales get in the way. Brunette staggered onto his feet. Black blood pumped down his leg, soaking into his jeans and making them shine under the streetlights. It stank. Valen curled his lip at the male. Darkness coursed through him in response, growing stronger, rising to consume him as it often did. His father's gift to all his sons, born of his blood in their veins. A dangerous, often undeniable hunger to destroy. Valen loved it. He knew the second that darkness manifested, shifting like a malevolent shadow across his features and turning his eyes black, because the demons glanced at each other and looked ready to bolt. No, not on his watch. His teeth ached, canines sharpening, and the darkness gripped him tighter, squeezing the light out of him, just the way he loved it. Brunette turned to make a break for it. Two throwing knives put an end to that, the first slamming to the hilt in his right calf and the second burying deep into the back of his skull, dropping him like a sack of bricks onto the ground. Blondie turned wide, fearful eyes on his dead companion, and then slowly looked back at him. "You're next," Valen grinned. Movement on his senses was the only warning he had before the soft fragrance of roses and sin hit him and knocked him off kilter. Threw him right off his game, in fact. He pivoted on his heel and blocked the knife little assassin had aimed at him, ripping a startled gasp from her and knocking her backwards. She recovered quickly, coming at him again, her blue eyes flashing with determination. Another thrust of the blade. This one he blocked a little harder with his forearm, enough that it was probably going to leave a bruise. He frowned as she regrouped and came at him again, and he realized it wasn't a knife she held. It was a syringe. What the actual fuck? Why the hell did she keep trying to drug him? He clucked his tongue and stepped, closing the short distance between them in a heartbeat, his face twisting into a sneer as he reached her. Wide blue eyes hit his, and she blinked hard, the only outward sign that he had startled her again. He towered over her. Such a little thing, but so fierce and fiery. Even faced with him as he was now, consumed by the darkness, hungry for blood and violence, she stood her ground and was recovering her wits. He could see it in her eyes as they slowly narrowed, could almost hear her rapidly considering every move she could make and every consequence of that action. "That for me?" he murmured, and jerked his chin towards the glass syringe she gripped in her right hand. He half expected her to shake her head, had met enough mortals and fought enough demons to know how most of them would respond given the situation. She nodded. Her fingers twitched. In a lightning-fast strike, he caught her hand and squeezed it. She cried out as the glass smashed under the pressure, and staggered backwards as he released her, clutching her bleeding hand. Valen smiled. "We all have our little problems." Panic lit her eyes. He turned away from her and hurled his remaining blade at Blondie, because the damned idiot was standing in the middle of the square gawping at him, and the assassin and he should have been running, or taking advantage of Valen's distraction to at least attack him as he had anticipated. It seemed everyone was bent on doing the opposite of what he expected tonight. The blade nailed him in his left pectoral, and Valen frowned, anger with the assassin and the demons condensing into anger at himself for missing his target. 6 centuries of playing with knives, and not once had he missed the exact spot he had intended to hit. Rather than watching the demon writhe in agony as he clutched the blade protruding from his heart, Valen had to go all the way across the damn square to recover it. He stomped over to the demon, ignoring the way his little assassin went into full meltdown behind him, muttering some not very complimentary things about him in her native tongue, pulled the blade from Blondie's chest as the demon blankly stared at it, and ran it across his throat. And yeah, he might have put a little lightning in it, because the bastard went down shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. He glanced back over his shoulder and found the assassin too preoccupied with her predicament to notice the way the demon was switching back and forth between mortal and scaled monstrosity. He took a few steps back towards her, the black haze lifting as his body got the message that the fight was done. Over before it had really begun. Disappointing as always. The assassin lifted her head, skin pale as snow and eyes round as saucers. He hazarded a guess that she wasn't sure what had been in that syringe, but that she thought it was lethal. Not his problem. So why was he finding it hard to leave? Why did he want to go to her and check her hand and see if he could figure out what the bastards had given her to use on him? He shut down his softer side and shoved it back into place where it belonged. If he felt any need to find out what poison had been in the syringe, it was because he needed to meet with his brothers later and he could report it to them, together with how persistent her client was getting. It had nothing to do with her. He edged back a step, distancing himself, and she swallowed hard. Her blue eyes turned glassy as she wavered on her feet, whatever drug had been in the vial already affecting her. Was it going to kill her? Was it wrong that he didn't want it to? She was out to kill him, which should have been enough for him to want her dead, yet he couldn't bring himself to end her. He couldn't bring himself to watch her die either. He turned away from her, focused on his apartment, and stepped. Something grabbed him from behind and fell away as he landed in his apartment, hitting the tiled floor with a hard thump and a muffled grunt. Valen looked down at the assassin where she lay at his feet, breathing hard, her skin flushed now and pupils rapidly switching between wide, deep pools of alluring darkness and pinpricks. What the fuck had been in that syringe? Whatever it was, he wasn't sure it was killing her. He bent over and pulled her onto her feet, and she didn't try to fight him. She melted into him, a limp little thing in his arms, fragile, delicate. "Who sent you?" Fear crossed her beautiful face, and he had the impression it wasn't the drug making her scared now. She was afraid of her client. "No one can find you here. I'll keep you safe." He frowned, blinked. Had he just said those words? He struggled to focus as his head became heavy and a deep hunger began to burn in his gut. A dangerous hunger. What the fuck? He blinked again and looked down at her hand and then maneuvered her so he could see his own. Blood stained it. His blood. He squeezed his eyes shut as the throbbing in his head grew worse, and then opened them and peered down at his hand. Something glimmered in the overhead light. A splinter of glass. Fucked. Royally fucked. "Why?" she murmured, and God's, it was the sweetest thing he had ever heard. Lit up his blood like a sultry whisper, and made the burning inside him grow hotter, fiercer. Damn. Not a poison meant to kill. He laughed and she frowned at him. He knew it was an inappropriate response, but she would probably find it hilarious if she knew what the fuck her client had just given to her. She wriggled in his arms. "I tried to kill you." Her question made sense now. He wasn't one to hold grudges. Not really. Well, maybe a little. "Who sent you?" he said again, but he couldn't get his damn voice above a whisper now, just as she couldn't. It was already fucking with his head. He set her down on his black leather couch and ripped the splinter of glass from his hand. A pointless endeavor. The drug was already in his system. It was a waiting game now. Sooner or later he would purge it. He glanced at the assassin as she wilted on his couch, slumping so her top half was lying on the seats, and her legs dangled so her sexy little knee-high black boots hit the floor. Valen told himself not to do it, fought for control, but his eyes betrayed him and roamed up those kinky boots, over tight black jeans and the sinful curve of her hip, to her leather jacket. It had spilled open, revealing another wicked little number, this one a red halter top that barely held her breasts in as she lay on his couch. In his apartment, alone with him. He rubbed a hand over his mouth, groaned as he smelled her on it, but not only her. The sweet poison she had managed to hit him with filled his nostrils too. The throbbing in his head roamed lower, mingled with that intoxicating, needy heat in his gut, and kept going, flames licking downwards. He groaned and resisted rubbing a hand over another part of his anatomy. This wasn't good. "Who sent you?" He tried to make it sound demanding, but he sounded out of breath, on the verge of panting. Valen sucked down a deep breath and held it, and almost laughed at himself again, as if that was going to make a damn difference. The assassin rolled onto her back, flinging her right arm above her head, and gods, she had to stop doing shit that made her look so damn tempting, at least until his body purged the drug. "There was a woman this time," she murmured, her eyes slipping shut, and slowly lowered her right hand. "This time?" His eyes narrowed on her. At least she was being more talkative, giving him information he could use. "Was a guy before, working together." She toyed with the black lengths of her hair, twirled a blue strand around her fingers, and sighed. He damn near came in his pants. "Up," he snapped, and when she didn't budge, he stalked over to her, grabbed her right arm, and yanked her onto her feet. She crumpled into a heap on his floor, shaking so hard he thought she might rattle something loose. He bent to pick her up again. The second he wrapped his hand around her arm, electricity bolted through him, and the way she gasped said she had felt it too. Not his power, though. This was something else. Something a little too dangerous for his liking. He pulled her up and she fell into him, her hands pressing against his chest, scalding him through his t-shirt even though she was freezing. "What's happening to me?" she whispered as she looked up at his face. "You got a taste of your own medicine." He gazed down at her, fighting the hazy warmth that had crept up his arm from his palm and the words it whispered to him. "Kiss her." Her eyes dropped to his mouth as if she had heard that same demand, but her shaking worsened and her skin paled further. This wasn't good. "I'm going to die." Her face twisted, pain filling her eyes and driving out the desire, fear that called to him. Valen cradled her closer and closed his eyes, losing his fight against the drug. "Don't let me die," she whispered against his chest. Gods, that tore at him. He wrapped his arms around her. "I won't let you go." This wasn't good at all. Chapter 4. Valen lifted the assassin into his arms and stumbled through the huge living room of his apartment, heading towards the bathroom. He bumped off the dark wooden wall of the corridor and she moaned, curling up in his arms. He murmured an apology and held her closer, a trickle of panic running through him. Was she going to die? He shouldn't care. He really shouldn't. So why did it feel as though his heart was being torn apart all over again? It was the drug. It was fucking with him. He shook his head to clear the hot haze from it and walked onwards, staggered really. This wasn't good at all. The fog in his head turned into a strange sort of lightness that made the hallway spin in front of his eyes. He tried to shake it off. That only made the room spin faster. Fuck. He shut his eyes and used his senses to guide him to the bathroom. By the time he had passed the 2 bedrooms to reach it, his head felt heavy again. Almost normal. He risked opening his eyes. The hallway remained mercifully still. Valen shoved the wooden door to the bathroom open and carried the assassin inside. He had to get her warm. A voice at the back of his mind said what he had to do was call his brothers. He was in deep shit and he knew it. "No," he bit out, and she looked up at him, blue eyes hazy but questioning him. "Wasn't talking to you." She remained staring at him, teeth chattering and lips almost as pale as her cheeks. Damn it. He set her down on the floor, afraid to risk putting her on the closed toilet seat in case she fell and hit her head, and went to the claw-footed tub. He twisted the taps and paused as water thundered into the empty bath. What the hell was he doing? He looked back at her where she sat by the door, clawing at her clothes as if she wanted to rip them off, even though she was freezing. He wasn't sure why he was helping her. Fuck, she wanted to kill him. He eyed her hand, although he wasn't sure the drug was meant to end him. The way she was squirming as he stared at her, her eyes fixed on his and imploring him, echoed everything that was boiling up inside him. Gods, he wanted her, craved her, needed her. It's the drug, he said, more to himself than to her, needing to fill the room with the sound of something other than her soft whimpers. It'll wear off in a day or two. At least he thought it would. He really needed to call Marek at least. As the brains of the bunch, his older brother was sure to know what had been in the syringe. But that would mean bringing Marek here to her, when she was under the influence of the drug. He snarled at the thought, darkness rising in his blood to obliterate it. Never. None of his brothers were coming near this place, near her, when she was like this. His growl rumbled through the room as he stalked towards her, and rather than being afraid of him on hearing the inhuman sound, her eyes grew darker, hungrier, as if he had thrilled her rather than frightened her. He caught her wrist and pulled her onto her feet. She didn't protest as he shoved her leather jacket off her, or even when her holster followed it, her guns hitting the white marble floor tiles with a loud crack. If anything, she writhed harder, and the way she tried to press against him, gods. Some part of his fucked-up brain was still functioning, though, because he managed to ignore the urge to surrender to her and scooped her up into his arms instead. She looked pleased, her blue eyes dark with her desire, and threaded her arms around his neck in a way that maddened him, pushing him right to the edge. He dumped her in the bath, ripping a shocked shriek from her and splashing water all over the tiles. She floundered, tossing more water over the side, and he caught her shoulders, shoved her back against the white tub, and glared at her. Stay! Because he was having a hard enough time controlling himself when she was in a position where he couldn't really get at her. If she left the tub, he wouldn't be able to resist her. He glanced at his hand and bit out a ripe curse. When she was well again, he was going to find whoever had sent her after him and fuck them up. They had done this on purpose. Valen sank to his knees beside the tub, not giving a damn as water soaked into his jeans, his hands still clutching her bare shoulders to keep her in place in the hot water. He rested his chin on the curved top of the bath and breathed slowly, trying to bring himself back down and muster some control over his body. She stared at him, stunning blue eyes bright in the light that reflected off all the white tiles surrounding them, calm and tranquil, oddly distant. A little color returned to her cheeks. Her lips grew rosy again. He wanted to kiss them, needed to taste them, taste her. He closed his eyes. How the fuck was he getting out of this one? Did he even want to get out? Valen opened his eyes, locking them straight on hers. She was beautiful, breathtaking. Water dripped from the tangled strands of her short hair, rolling down the black and blue to leave trails down her cheeks that he wanted to wipe away. His hands felt too heavy to lift, though, too good against her bare skin, feeling her warmth as it returned to chase the cold away. She blinked slowly, shuddering those eyes that he wanted to stare into for eternity, never looking away. He wanted to drown in them. The drug was something from the Underworld if he had to guess. It felt similar to the tonic some of the Hellspawn bars added in small doses to their brews to provide their patrons with a relaxing buzz that really took the edge off, something which he had indulged in from time to time. It would make sense that a demon might know how to make the same drug, and how it would affect him. What didn't make sense was sending her to deliver it, unless this was all part of the plan. If it was she in on that part? No. His gut said that she wasn't. She had thought the drug would kill him, had been terrified when he had crushed the glass container in her hand and exposed her to it. She didn't know it was an aphrodisiac. The hungry look in her eyes and the way her cheeks flushed as she raked her gaze over him said she was beginning to get the message, though. He rubbed his thumbs across her bare shoulders and she shivered, but not from cold. Her skin was hot beneath his hands now, but she would get cold again if he didn't get her dried off and into something warm before the water temperature dropped. His bed sounded like a good place to put her, and then he could get into it with her and into something warm, somewhere he hadn't been in too long. He shook that thought away and focused on lifting her from the tub and getting her dry. Water sluiced from her clothes as he set her down on the tiles, and she slipped, her boots skidding on the slick surface. He probably should have removed those before putting her in the bath. He bent to remove them now, and her hands came down on his shoulders, heating him through his coat. He tried to ignore how good her touch felt, how that heat seeped into him right down to his bones. Tried and failed. He really had to call his brothers. He growled and she froze. A little shiver racked her, and then she moaned and brushed her fingers through the short hair at the back of his head. Valen swatted her hand away and went back to her boots. It didn't stop her. She pushed hot little fingers through his hair, curled them around the longer lengths on top, and surprised him by yanking his head back so he was staring up at her. Sweet gods! Hot lust bolted through every inch of him in response, a hunger the magnitude of which he had never felt before. She towered over him, her wet red halter top clinging to her breasts and her stomach, revealing everything to him. Her nipples beaded and he bit back a groan, ached with a need to rise up on his knees and suck on them through the material of her top. Her blue eyes dared him to do it. Water rolled down her chest, between the valley of her breasts, and his breath shortened as he followed a drop. Cock ached as it hit the triangular cups of her top and soaked into the material. Temptress. Fuck, he barked and forced himself to pull her hand from his hair and shove it away. He wasn't sure how he managed to do it, or to return to removing her boots as if nothing had just happened. She hadn't just issued him an invitation to do wicked things to her. It was the drug. She placed her hand on his head again, smoothed her fingers over his hair, and stroked the curve of his right ear. It was just the drug making her do this. He savored it anyway, soaked it all up like some pathetic sap, even though it was a bitter pill to swallow. She wouldn't touch him, wouldn't want him if she was in control. The drug was affecting her, and it was affecting him too, and he couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. He finally got the damn fucking zippers on her boots down and pulled them off, tossing them a little too harshly across the room, judging by the sound of splintering marble. Temper. It was taking a nosedive as he worked to get her out of her wet clothes, touching parts of her that he shouldn't be touching. Her hips as he undid her belt and her jeans. Her thighs as he shimmied the wet material down her legs. God's help him. He tried not to look as he revealed them, but he wasn't a saint. He was as sinful as they came. She moved, shattering the fragile hold he had on his control, and he looked up at her as he reached her ankles with her jeans, and couldn't bite back the groan this time. She pulled her red top off, and he ended up on his arse, stunned by the sight of her. Seduced. Her top hit the floor with a wet slap, but he couldn't rip his eyes away from her. He couldn't breathe. He had never seen anything so sensual, so alluring. His eyes dropped to her left leg, to the start of a black and violet ink artwork that mesmerized him. A point above her knee grew into a scaly tail that snaked around her thigh, before sprouting two legs with clawed feet that gripped her above her hip on her stomach and just below it. The tattoo disappeared around her back, before reappearing on her right, where claws penetrated her hip, and a long neck gracefully curved over the flat plane of her stomach, to end in an ornate dragon's head that sat with its open jaw on either side of her navel. Between the dragon's teeth, in the sensual hollow of that navel, sat a diamond that looked for all the world as if the dragon was holding it. Sweet gods! Valen swallowed hard. She skimmed her hands down over her chest, cupping her bare breasts, and stared at him with that challenge back in her eyes. He wanted to take her up on it, really wanted to. She had to know that, had to see it in his eyes as he waged war with himself. He had never been honorable, never been a good man. Why the hell was he starting now? She bit her lip, teasing it with her teeth in a way that told him to forget reforming himself and just give in to her. He couldn't. Gods, why couldn't he? What the fuck was wrong with him? It wasn't real. That's what was wrong. All of it. It was the drug. That tossed a bucket of ice water on his libido and gave him the strength to get onto his feet, pull off his coat and sling it around her, removing the tempting sight of her from his eyes. She frowned and tried to wriggle out of his coat. Valen growled at her, flashing teeth, and held it tighter, refusing to budge. He had it together, but he wasn't sure how long he could hold it that way. It wouldn't take much for him to be back on his arse, on his knees, panting for her, and he wasn't sure he would be strong enough to claw back enough control and resist next time. He pulled her back into his arms, carried her out of his bathroom, and took a left into the first bedroom. She scowled at him as he crossed the tiled floor in the pale yellow-walled room and dumped her on the huge wooden bed. He grabbed the blanket and tossed it over her. Sleep. Even as he said it, he knew it wasn't going to happen. She had that look in her eyes again. Moonlight shone through the two windows beyond the bed, illuminating her where she lay in it, highlighting her smooth skin as she shirked his black coat and writhed beneath the thin white covers. Gods, they did nothing to hide her from his eyes, seemed to cling to every dangerous curve as she moved in a sensual dance, one designed to lure him to her. She had to know what she was doing. Fucking temptress. He had to call his brothers, let them take over, question her or something while he pulled his shit together. He reached into his jeans for his phone. She reached a hand out to him. Valen paused, torn between calling his brothers and answering her call. His little assassin made his decision for him by shoving the pale covers aside, getting onto all fours and crawling towards him across the king-size bed. He shook his head, his fingers trembling against his phone as he silently begged her not to push him. He wasn't a fucking hero. He didn't have that sort of willpower. Everything good in him said to back away as she reached him, but his feet wouldn't cooperate. She fisted his black t-shirt in one hand and then the other, pulling herself up and pulling him down at the same time. Move. He had to move. Her right hand slid around the nape of his neck, and it was game over as she dragged his mouth down against hers. Roses and sin. She tasted as delicious as she smelled. He groaned, slanted his head, and claimed her mouth, thrusting his tongue past the seal of her lips and seizing all of her. She moaned, arched against him and held him tighter, clung to him as if he was her savior, not her damnation. His hand shook, the temptation to grab her and lay claim to all of her almost overpowering him. He shoved those hands into his pockets, but even that wasn't enough to stop him from aching to touch her, to weigh the firm globes of her breasts in his palms before he devoured them with his mouth. The feel of her hand on the belt of his jeans had him jerking backwards. He staggered away from her, only stopping when his back hit the wall of his bedroom, and shook his head, warning her to keep her distance. She held her hand out to him again. It was bleeding. Valen couldn't stop himself from walking towards her, drawn by a need to take care of her that he couldn't understand. He took her hand, felt it shaking in his, trembling with the same need that coursed through him. He lifted it to his lips and licked the shallow cuts, groaned and shuddered as he tasted her blood and the drug. It was potent, instantly washing away all his doubts and his fears, allowing need to master him once more. He lifted his eyes to hers and found them dark and inviting as she watched him, her lips parted and rosy from his kiss. On a snarl, he tossed her hand aside, claimed the nape of her neck with his left hand, and seized her mouth with his own. She moaned and melted into him in the most delicious way, and he swore he could feel her need pounding in his veins, beating in his heart. He didn't stop her when she reached for his belt this time. Couldn't. His will to resist had shattered the moment his lips had touched hers, and now he was as shackled by need as she was, a slave to this deep craving blossoming inside him, this dark urge to lose himself in her. He tore his mouth away from hers only long enough to rip his t-shirt over his head. When he went to seize her mouth again, her hands on his bare chest stopped him in his tracks, and the way she looked upon him set his blood on fire until it burned like an inferno. He wasn't sure anyone had ever looked at him like that, as if she wanted to eat him up, devour every inch of him. Mercy. She caught him off guard, springing from the bed into his arms and knocking him back into the wall. He grunted as his back hit it hard, and she swallowed it in a fierce kiss. Her lips meshed with his, tongue sweeping across them one moment and teeth teasing the next. Her bare breast plastered against his chest, her heart pounding with the same staccato rhythm as his. Out of control. He groaned into her mouth and grabbed her backside as she wrapped her legs around his waist, pressing her hot core against his aching erection. Her fingers tangled in his hair, plowing through the long lengths on top, and he gritted his teeth as she yanked his head back. Damn. Some fucker out there had made her for him. Words swam at the back of his mind, a hazy warning about curses that dissipated as she went to work on his jeans, fumbling around between her legs, driving him crazy with need. Her lips were hot on his throat, scorching a trail down it as she pulled his head back further, forcing him to obey. He groaned and held her closer, palmed her backside and drank every drop of pleasure she sent blazing through his body. Her hand found his hard cock, and he shuddered, an involuntary whimper escaping him that he pretended not to hear because thankfully she didn't seem to hear it either. She was too busy stroking him, teasing the blunt head with masterful fingertips that had his knees turning to jelly and legs ready to buckle. He reached between them and pulled her hand away before she did any permanent damage. No fucking way this ended with him spilling all over her panties. She moaned, writhed harder, and yanked his head down. Her lips claimed his again, her kiss hard and demanding, pressing him into turning the tables on her. She wanted it rough. He growled as she snagged his lower lip between her teeth, sending a sharp lance of pain down his jaw, and tugged on it. Damn, he would show her rough. He turned with her and slammed her against the wall, and she moaned in response. Wicked little assassin. She rocked against him as he kissed her, seizing control of it and dominating her with every stroke of his tongue along hers, not letting her have her way. She tried to bite him again, and he caught her by her jaw, clucked his tongue and held her fast as he kissed her. She moaned, writhed, and wriggled, pressing her damp core against his aching erection. Too much. He pinned her to the wall with his body so he could use his hands, and tore her panties away, groaned as his throbbing shaft was suddenly exposed to the slick warmth of her. She moaned louder, rocked harder. Valen gave her what she wanted. He eased back, grasped his cock, and shifted it down, running the blunt head over her clitoris, teasing her with it. She leaned her head back and grasped his shoulders, constantly moving in his arms, as if she couldn't keep still, as if need mastered her just as it mastered him, and she was a slave to it, wouldn't be able to stop moving until it was satisfied. He could do that for her. He could satisfy both of their needs. He buried himself in her in one hard, unforgiving stroke, driving her into the wall. She cried out, the sound born of pleasure rather than pain as he filled her, stretching her around his cock, making her take all of him. Her nails pressed into his shoulders, and he grunted as she clawed at him, her face screwed up in bliss. He seized her mouth as he withdrew and plunged back into her, claiming her body. She clung to him, her legs wrapping tight around his waist, holding him to her as her nails raked over his shoulders, leaving her mark on him just as he ached to leave his mark on her. She would never forget him. He kissed her hard as he drove into her, giving her everything she wanted, everything he needed. She was hot, tight, heavenly. He grunted and thrust deeper, long hard strokes to make her feel every inch of him, to claim every inch of her. She released his right shoulder, and he moaned as she clawed at the wall, rocked and writhed in his arms, lost in the moment. He was right there with her, his little assassin. He frowned as he thrust back into her, tore his mouth away from hers, much to her disapproval, judging by the way she grabbed his neck and tried to pull him back to her. He tensed, not letting her have her way, but kept pounding into her, unable to stop now that he had started, not until he felt her shatter around him. "Name," he uttered, and she frowned at him as if he had gone mad, or had at least forgotten English. If she expected him to string a sentence together when he was screwing his brain out, she had another thing coming. "Your name." She threw her head back as he plunged into her. "Ava! God!" He frowned now, thrust harder as she tensed around him, her breasts bouncing with each meeting of their bodies as they strained together, reaching for release that promised to be mind-blowing. "Ava?" he rasped, strangled and hoarse as she clenched him, showing him just how tight she could go and almost making him choke. "Uh-huh." She nodded, and then her fine black eyebrows shot up as he angled his hips and drove deeper. "Oh, oh, oh." More like it. Valen buried his face in the curve of her throat, breathed in her subtle scent of roses, sin, and sex, taking her all in. "Ava, I could drown in you." He kissed her neck and she tilted her head, let him at it as she clung to him. He held her tighter, pinning her breasts against his chest. "I could die right now and wouldn't care." Her hands came down on his back, but she didn't claw and scratch him. She stroked him, almost tenderly, and then she bit his shoulder. "I'll die along with you." She licked the place she had bitten as if she wanted to soothe him, but her words had sent him shooting too far out of his head for him to feel any pain. She would? He growled, a possessive and hungry snarl that vibrated through every inch of him, born of his entire being, body, heart, and soul. He drove deep into her and she cried into his ear, going taut for a heartbeat before she trembled in his arms and around his cock, body quivering and milking him. He grunted and moved faster, deeper, hungry to find his own release as she found hers. It came upon him in a swift, blinding flash, almost sending him to his knees as he spilled inside her. She moaned with each hard throb of his cock, the sounds of her pleasure music to his ears as he stood frozen against her, immobilized by the force of his release. Ava stroked his shoulder, peppering it with soft kisses between quiet whimpers as her body continued to spasm. He rested his head on her shoulder, pressed his forehead against her neck, and held her up by her backside, breathing hard as he tried to settle his pounding pulse. A sinking, cold feeling filled his chest, pushing out all the heat and light. A sensation that he would never be the same again, that being with Ava had been his greatest mistake yet, because it had altered something fundamental in him, something he had been guarding closely his entire life. His heart. It beat hard as he held her, feeling her trembling in his arms, her body quivering around his, and little pants of air escaping her as she struggled to come down from the high of her climax. Something awakened inside him, something fierce, dangerously possessive. Whatever her plans had been, he was changing them now. No more fighting. Just this craziness and passion. That was all there was going to be between them now. Sparks. They skittered over his skin, burrowed deep into his flesh, and seemed to bring him to life, rousing the dark side of his blood, the part of him that had come from his father, and cried out to brand her with his name, to make sure that she was his. He pulled free of her and carried her to the bed as she rested her cheek on his shoulder. He pressed his right knee into the mattress and laid her down on it, and placed his hands on either side of her ribs, as he drew back with the intention of kissing her and starting round two. She was out cold. He canted his head and studied her, absorbing her beauty as she lay beneath him. It wasn't her naked body that held his attention, though, or the sensual way her dragon tattoo curled around her curves, and the jewel in her navel sparkled in the moonlight. It was her rosy, kiss-swollen lips, and the way her long black lashes rested against her flushed cheeks. She looked content, satisfied, and he had been the one to do that. He couldn't remember the last time he had made someone happy. Valen lifted his right hand and brushed his knuckles across her cheek, feeling her warmth and her softness, mesmerized by all of her. She truly was beautiful. That beauty was only made more devastating by what he knew about her. She was a fighter, a warrior. Gods, it shouldn't be a turn-on, but it was. It made him burn hotter for her. She knew what it was like to walk in his world, to face insurmountable odds and be the victor, to battle hard to live to see another day. His hand shook and he shoved it back against the bed, ashamed of how weak she made him, how uncertain and pathetic. Would she be all right now? The haze that had come over him, the urge to lose himself in her, had faded the moment he had climaxed. Was it the same for her? He hoped so. He went to press his hand to her forehead to check her temperature. His phone rang. "Fuckers," he muttered, knowing exactly who it would be on the other end of the line. Only his brothers had his number. They would choose now to bother him when he wanted to be alone with her. Just a little while longer. He glanced at the clock on the wooden bedside table to his left, cursed when he saw it was well past the time he was meant to have shown up at the mansion in Tokyo for their meeting. He was lucky they had only called him and hadn't popped into his apartment to get an eyeful of him and Ava. Ava. Not the name of an angel, unless it was short for something. Had to be the case. His mother's visions were never wrong when she consulted nature. The name of an angel and the skill of a devil. He smiled and stroked Ava's cheek. There was more devil than angel in her. He dipped his head, pressed a soft kiss to her lips, and then pushed away from her. "Won't be long," he whispered as he covered her. He fastened his jeans, grabbed his t-shirt and pulled it on, and focused on the old mansion in Tokyo. Darkness swirled around him, comforting him as he steeled himself. His brothers were going to be pissed, but then that was nothing new. They were always upset with him about something. He appeared in the middle of the main living space of the old Japanese building, and silence descended. "What's up?" He shot for casual and hit irritating, judging by the looks Karis, Aries, and Diamond gave him. Just the three of them. He glanced around, expecting to find his idiotic fellow blonde youngest brother somewhere in the circle of comfortable armchairs and couches, blowing the shit out of something in a video game. It seemed Cal was either late or had left already, and Valen bet his left bollock it was the latter. Marek, the brunette smarty-pants of the group, was missing too, together with their somewhat deranged older brother Escher. Now that was unusual. Valen might have understood Escher's lack of appearance if Megan had been with Aries, because the sight of them mooning over each other sickened Valen too. But it wasn't like Escher to be absent from anything, especially when it was taking place in his home. Escher was insanely protective of the mansion, and Valen could understand why. Even he found this place calming and beautiful now. It hadn't been the case when he and all of his brothers had lived here, but now they had their own spaces, and he was normally here when everyone but Escher was absent. It had a certain appeal to it. He glanced to his left to where someone had slid back the wooden-framed white screens to reveal the courtyard in the middle of the three sides of the single-story mansion, and the garden beyond. So much nature. He wished it would soothe him now, but his hackles had gone up the second he had realized he had been left alone with the three biggest dicks in his family, and there wasn't enough calming nature in the fucking world to bring them back down, not when he could sense a confrontation coming. "He out at the gate?" Valen peered over his shoulder and leaned left a little so he could see into the kitchen at the opposite end of the long room to the TV area, just in case the only other brother who had ever fought in his corner was in there. Nope. He was shit out of luck. Karis calmly closed the book he held on his knees, set it down on the low wooden coffee table in the middle of the couches, and rose onto his feet. His eldest brother's green eyes hardened like diamonds, reminding him of their father. They both had that regal, too handsome bone structure and pitch-black hair. Valen had tried to adjust that bone structure and rearrange that hair a few times in his life. Unfortunately, Karis was irritatingly good at fighting and healed just as quickly as the rest of them. Aries stood behind Karis and folded his muscular arms across his broad chest, causing his black t-shirt to pull tight across them, accentuating his build. Boy needed to shop for a bigger size, but Valen didn't expect him to get that. He always had been more brawn than brains. Karis's little guard dog. The fiery edge to Aries' dark eyes said not to test him. Diamond sighed dramatically and shoved black leather-clad fingers through his softly spiked white hair, his pale blue eyes shifting between him and Karis. If he wanted to make a point, he was going to have to be blunter than that. "Yeah, I'm late. I get it. Yeah, we're going to fight. Again. No need for the theatrics, brother." Valen stuck his hands in his jeans pockets. I was busy. So the same excuse as always. Karras took a step forwards. Not a hard one, just a light step, but it was enough to convey the same amount of anger and irritation that a hard one, complete with a stamp of the foot, would have. His brother had that sort of talent. It's the truth. My little friend is back. Boy, was she back. He almost grinned, but schooled his features so his brothers couldn't see his amusement, because they would probably mistake it for something else and tear him a new one. What have you learned, Valen? Ares actually had the balls to emerge from behind Karras, coming to stand beside him. It seemed his second eldest brother was getting bolshy since falling in love. It had only taken him close to 1,000 years to grow a pair. Valen mulled over what to tell them. Karras's green eyes demanded everything and said he wouldn't be satisfied with an answer short of that, and Valen did want to get back to Ava as soon as possible. So for once, he didn't bother to lead his brothers on a dance designed to piss them off. She's an assassin. I think demons hired her. She's tried drugging me twice now. And succeeded once. Okay, so he wasn't going to tell them everything. He paced a little towards the open doors to the garden, feeling everyone's eyes boring into him as he searched for a sense of peace in all the flowing water, stone lanterns, and green moss. He glanced back at his brothers where they had remained in the far end of the enormous rectangular room. She's human. Shock rippled across their faces. Very satisfying. You killed her? Karras said, and Valen got another pleasing round of horrified looks when he shook his head. He shrugged and turned his back on the garden, pacing back across the pale golden tatami mats that covered the floor. It was only then he realized he was still wearing his boots. In his haste to get to the meeting and back again as quickly as possible, he had teleported straight into the mansion rather than to the porch outside. He looked at the wooden door opposite him, suddenly glad Escher wasn't around, because his brother would have lost it. Escher was a sucker for rules, traditions, that sort of shit. Not removing his shoes outside and placing them on the rack probably would have earned him a going over, and Escher was the one brother he hated fighting. While he was usually immune to his own power, something about Escher's ability to manipulate water turned his lightning against him, conducting it in a way that fed it back into him. Sure, normally it was only mild pain, sometimes a little burn or two. Sometimes it was worse than that, though. Sometimes he ended up having to grow shit back. He flexed the fingers of his left hand and shook away the image of them charred, flesh blistered and peeling in some places, and completely melted away in others, leaving only blackened bones behind. Bile rose up his throat and he swallowed it hard. It had taken him over a week to heal that injury. A week of Escher's guilty looks and his other brother's merciless teasing about having a damn skeletal hand. Valen closed his eyes and focused on the present. Ava danced across his dark vision, the bright blue streaks in her hair shining as vibrantly as her dazzling eyes. I have her captive, and I will question her. He snuck a glance at his phone. He had already been gone over 20 minutes. He wasn't sure when she would wake, and he didn't want her to wake alone. Bring her in, Valen. Diamond this time. And wasn't it just like him to want to play by the rules to please their self-appointed boss? Valen shook his head again. No. My captive, my rules. I can just go and get her myself. Those words might have been the biggest mistake Karras had ever made. Valen snarled at him and lightning raced down his arms, crackled across his fingers and arced between them and the tatami mat floor of the building, snapping as they struck it and leaving black scorch marks behind. Dare, he barked and glared at his brothers. She is my business, not yours. Karras calmly took another step forwards. Our business. If she works for the ones who targeted Ares, she is a direct link to the threat to our gates. Our world, Valen. He knew that, and he knew the right thing to do, but neither of those things stopped him from raising his hands and taking aim at his brother. Ava was his. Karras took another step, his green eyes darkening, shadows building in them that warned he was close to getting a reaction out of his older brother for the first time in a long time, and he wouldn't like it when it happened. Bring her in now, Valen. Go to hell. It's my business. Valen threw his hands forward but managed to stop himself from unleashing his power as he pointed to Ares. You let him deal with his shit alone, and that means I get to deal with this alone. You come near Rome. I don't think I need to say what will happen. He stepped before any of his brothers could respond, but rather than returning to his apartment, he landed on a grassy hilltop overlooking Rome and slumped onto his backside on the dewy grass. He was pushing his luck. Karis might give him a day to cool down, but his brother would come knocking, and Valen couldn't blame him. He was right, after all. Ava was a direct link to those who had targeted Ares, those who wanted to destroy the gates they protected. Rome flashed between the current world and the one to come, what he and his brothers had termed the other world. The yellow pinpricks of light that illuminated the beautiful mix of buildings and ancient archaeological sites became fire that spewed from the broken ground, and fault lines intersected the city, some as deep and wide as ravines, threatening to swallow it all. The Colosseum had shattered in half at the edge of one yawning abyss, the remaining stones ravaged by lava and crawling with black specks. Beasts, things not of this world nor his one, born in the fires of destruction wrought by the demons. Screams tore apart the waning night whenever the other world flashed over the current one, and he closed his eyes against the sight of his city burning, but couldn't shut out the terrified wails of the mortals as they were hunted and killed. Fucking Moirai. They had foreseen this event, and Hades had sent him and his brothers to protect the gates spread around the world, to guard the underworld and everyone in it from such a terrible fate, and at the same time protect the mortals. To keep them loyal to their mission, the Moirai had gifted him and his brothers with the ability to see the future of their city should they fail. It was more of a curse. All of them felt it. They all hated seeing the city they protected falling into ruin, seeing their failure whenever they gazed upon it. It pissed Valen off, because it made him feel he had already failed, that there was no way of stopping what the Moirai had seen from passing, and he knew his brothers felt the same. It didn't drive them to work harder because none of them could work harder. They had busted their balls for 2 centuries, never straying from their duty, waiting for their unknown enemy to emerge. It seemed that time was now. He opened his eyes and looked down at his city, watched as the sky lightened in the distance, signaling the start of a new day. He had never felt that so keenly as he did now, with Ava waiting for him to return. He needed to go back to his apartment, not so he could question her about her clients, not yet. Right now, he just needed to see her again. He needed to hold her in his arms. Chapter 5. Ava stretched and yawned, a strange warmth curling through the entire length of her body, a sensation she wasn't sure she had ever felt before and couldn't quite describe. Contentment? She had never been content and couldn't think of a reason why she would feel that way now. In fact, she couldn't recall much beyond heading out on a mission to make another attempt at delivering the drug to her mark. She slowly opened her eyes. Everything around her was hazy, a blur of brown, yellow, and bright white. She blinked rapidly, but her vision was slow to come into focus. When it did, she gasped and launched backwards, hit something hard, and scrambled for the covers when she realized she was naked, in a strange bedroom. Her gaze leaped around, charting everything from the tiled floor to the pale yellow walls and the wooden wardrobes that filled the space opposite her at the foot of the enormous bed, to the 2 huge windows to her left that allowed light to flood into the room and revealed a stunning view over Rome's rooftops. Her head throbbed in response to the sudden movements and the information overload, and she clutched it and buried it between her knees. She closed her eyes. What the hell had happened? Her mark flashed across her dark eyes, a distorted replay of him fighting 2 men. She snapped her head up and stared down at her palm, at the shallow healing cuts on it. Fuck. It all came flooding back. He had shattered the syringe in her hand, and then he had shattered her. The satisfied hum in her body made sudden, dreadful sense, the result of what she could only describe as mind-blowing sex. Ava groaned and slumped back against the hard wooden headboard. What had she done? She raised her hand in front of her, sighed as she stared at the lacerations, and slowly pieced together everything that had happened, from the moment she had tried to take her Mark down to the moment he had taken her. She groaned again and wished she could blame it all on him or the drug, but she dimly recalled he had tried to resist her, and the drug had only worked to loosen the hold she had on the desire she already felt for him. It was tempting to bury her head in her knees again, so she shoved the covers away and leaped into action instead, intent on salvaging some of her dignity. She was damned if he was going to find her in his room when he came back. Her feet hit the cold tiles and her knees gave out, turning to jelly beneath her. She clutched the mattress to stop herself from hitting the floor and pulled herself back up onto it. Damn, she needed a moment. The humming in her body grew stronger, sending a pulse through her, a hot wave of pleasure that rolled through her like an aftershock. Stronzo. She had avoided physical contact since becoming an assassin, but she could remember sleeping with men and none of them had ever left her this way. She cursed him, and then added a few more on top when she remembered that she had given him her name. Another first since stepping into her current line of work. She always kept everyone in the dark about her as much as possible. Even her clients only knew her by her alias, the Angel. Now her enemy knew her name. This wasn't going to end well. She looked at the door, intending to listen for him and see if she was alone. Instead, she caught a wicked flashback of being pinned against the wall beside it, his hard body driving into her as he gave her everything she had wanted. She had ached for him so badly last night, had needed him to the point where she had honestly felt as if she would die if the desire that had been blazing inside her hadn't been sated. By him. Ava bit her lip as another aftershock rolled through her. Stronzo. She was better than this, stronger than this. She pushed onto her feet again and refused to let her legs give out beneath her as she hurried across the room to the wardrobes. Relief blasted through her as she yanked the wooden doors open and found them full of clothes. She grabbed a t-shirt and a pair of combat trousers, both in black, and pulled them on. They were too big, dwarfing her despite her Mark's athletic frame. Ava held her trousers up as she padded quickly across the tiled floor to the door. She eased it open, peered both ways along the wood-paneled corridor. It was quiet. Either he was sleeping it off somewhere, was sitting in wait, or he was out. She prayed it was the latter and looked off to her right. The bathroom. A flash of him undressing her in there leaped across her eyes. She raced along the corridor, silent in her bare feet, and breathed a sigh of relief as she spotted her holster and leather jacket on the white marble floor in the bathroom, together with her boots. She quickly tugged her boots on, grimacing as she discovered they were damp and cold, and then slung her holster across her shoulders. God, the weight of her weapons felt good. She shrugged into her leather and turned to leave, paused as she saw the black bathrobe on the back of the door. She pulled the belt free of its loops and used it to hold her trousers up, tying it tightly around her waist. She paused again at the door and looked back at the claw-footed tub that was still full of water. A flash of him watching her while she had been in that tub, of his handsome face awash with concern, crashed over her, and she couldn't breathe as she struggled against the invisible tide, fighting the questions and the desire they stirred, a need to remain and see him again. She wanted to know why he had taken care of her. Ava shook her head, causing her short black hair to sway across her neck. No, she didn't. What she wanted was to get away before he returned. To sleep with a man was a mistake. To sleep with her Mark was beyond unacceptable. She had to leave now while she had the chance. She had complicated things enough. She was meant to be killing him, not giving him a joyride. Ava crept along the hall, keeping as quiet as she could in case he was hiding ahead of her, waiting for her to emerge. She reached into her jacket and drew her gun, and the weight of it in her right hand helped steady her nerves, as they rose with each step closer she came to the end of the corridor. Those nerves settled as she reached the open wood-walled room. She quickly scanned it, not bothering to take in any of the details, focused on ensuring that her Mark wasn't home. Good. She turned right towards a door that had a peephole. It had to be the exit. Ava hurried towards it, picking up speed now, and holstered her gun. The last thing she needed was someone in the apartment building seeing her with a weapon and calling the police. She stopped short of grabbing the handle as something shimmered across the wooden door. A trick of the light flooding the room from the windows behind her? She turned to look at them. Her mark stood right behind her. She moved in an instant, launching into action on instinct, her right fist flying at his face. He easily caught her hand. Golden eyes shifted to it, his handsome face cold and devoid of emotion as he studied her hand. He released it and she snatched it back, considered going for one of her weapons, and then thought the better of it when she caught the challenge in his striking eyes, the dare to do it. "Leaving without a goodbye kiss," he husked, and her damned knees weakened again, her heart pounding a hard rhythm as her eyes betrayed her and fell to his lips. Lips that had mastered hers, that had seared her flesh and set her on fire. "Stronzo," she bit out and reached for her weapon, no longer caring about the odds being against her. He was on her in a flash, his hand grasping her wrist and shoving it against her chest, pinning it there so she couldn't draw her weapon from its holster. Those lips she had been fantasizing about curled, flashing canines that seemed unusually long. He pushed her backwards, pinned her to the door, and she struggled against him, refusing to let him dominate her. He made a low growling noise in his throat when she managed to get her fingers around the grip of her gun and pressed her wrist harder against her chest, so hard it was difficult to breathe. Those golden eyes issued a demand. It took her a moment to remember he had asked her a question. "Kiss?" She gave him a confused look, and darkness flashed in his eyes. Almost stopped her in her tracks, but she pushed on, playing it cool and praying she was going to somehow get away with her life. She was done with this mission and this man. It was too dangerous. She was going to run. Benares might find her, but he might not, and that was a chance she was willing to take. "What are you talking about? Why would I kiss you?" Maybe she had put a little too much venom into that word because his expression darkened, a storm brewing in his eyes that set her nerves alight and had her pressing back against the door. Fear. She had felt it plenty of times in her life, enough that she should have been able to control it as she did with most of her emotions. But it was too powerful, shoving at that control, filling her with a need to escape and run, and she wasn't sure that it stemmed from her current position. She wasn't sure this fear had anything to do with her mark at all. His face softened, lips curling into a slight smile as he lowered his eyes to her mouth and released her arm. She tensed as he raised his hand, bracing herself for a blow. His palm touched her cheek and she flinched even though it was a light caress, not a hard strike, unable to stop the reaction her body had decided upon before he had even made contact. He frowned. "Because of last night." He smiled again, smoothed his palm across her cheek and down to her jaw. His touch was feather soft, but she was aware of his strength, knew he could snap her neck in a heartbeat if she said or did the wrong thing. She trembled as he caressed her, stirring heat in her veins and pulling memories of last night to the front of her mind again. Desire rushed through her on a wave of electric tingles, tinged with panic she couldn't quite shake. Her gaze slipped to his lips, and then shifted to the scar on the left side of his face. It started low on his jaw and ran down his neck to his collarbone, the skin ragged and distorted, as if someone had burned his flesh away. It both frightened and fascinated her. Everything about him screamed danger, but she felt no pressing need to move and escape him. She didn't fear him, not after last night. What she feared now were the sparks that leaped between them, intense and seductive, and the air of power and danger that he emanated, uncontrolled and wild, undeniably alluring. He growled and closed his hand around her throat, shoved her back against the door by it, but there wasn't any strength in his grip. He wasn't trying to hurt her. She lifted her eyes to his, caught the brief flare of pain in their incredible golden depths before he extinguished it. He had startled her to stop her from staring at the scar, because he hadn't liked it. If he didn't want people to see it, why did he wear the long lengths of his blonde hair down over the right side of his face and not the left? It would have covered the scar on his jaw and part of his neck. The pressure on her throat lessened as he eased back. "You don't remember last night," he said, his voice as soft as his expression now, almost docile and affectionate. "I tried to kill you last night," she countered and pushed his arm, moving his hand away from her. He eased back another step, a bonus she hadn't expected. "I don't know how I ended up here, but I'm leaving." Blonde eyebrows dropped low over golden eyes that brightened and locked on her, fixed so intently that she shivered under their scrutiny. "You don't remember making love?" Making love? If what had happened between them had been making love, then she wanted to see what raw, hungry sex with him was like. "The drug must have affected you too, because I don't recall fucking you." His hand closed over her cheek again. "You don't remember." His thumb grazed her lower lip, and her breath left her on a sigh that she couldn't hold back as she stared up into his dazzling golden eyes and slowly shook her head. Somehow she stopped herself from melting against him and found the strength to keep up her charade. "I want to kill you. Why would I fuck you? I would never fuck a Mark. I would never sleep with you." Those dangerous eyes darkened again, and his demeanor changed in a blink of them. He caught her jaw and tilted her head back, his eyes scouring hers. His were cold now, empty of the storm that had been building in them a moment before. He grabbed her arm and yanked her away from the door, and had it open and her out of it a second later. She hit the wall of the corridor hard, grunted as the impact sent fiery sparks rushing through the bones of her right arm and across her upper back. "Never, ever come after me again. The next time I see you, I will kill you. Do you understand?" Ava looked across at him. He slammed the door in her face. "Stronzo." But she had the feeling that word should be directed at her this time. She wasn't sure why. She sagged against the wall and waited for the pain to pass. The one radiating from her arm faded, but the one in her chest lingered as his ultimatum rang in her ears. She had already made up her mind that she would never see him again, so why did that ultimatum cut her like a blade? Ava clutched her right arm, looked back at the door, and lingered for a moment before forcing herself to walk away. She was going to walk away from all of this, disappear. She was going to get out of Rome, drive to her small villa in the north, and get her head straight. She needed space to get some perspective, and not only about him. Every instinct she possessed screamed she had been set up. The drug she had been given hadn't been poison. It had been some sort of aphrodisiac, which meant Benares had wanted her to end up sleeping with her Mark. Why? The cold gnawing in the pit of her stomach said she knew the answer to that question. Benares was using her to get to the man. Her Mark was an assassin like her, a master of his emotions, and a loner as far as she could tell, from the months she had been tailing him and learning all about him. Benares had already known those things about her Mark. She was sure of it now. And he had chosen her because they were alike. It had been his first step in bringing them together, a common ground they shared that would make it easier for his plan to come to fruition. That plan was turning her into her Mark's weakness. She could see that now, and was damned if she was going to allow it to happen. Benares had chosen the wrong woman for the job. She wasn't a whore. She was an assassin. She reached the bottom floor of the apartment building and stepped out into the street. A quick scan of her surroundings placed her far from the last place she recalled, the island in the Tiber River. She couldn't remember how she had come to be in his apartment. Everything between the square and his bathroom was a blur that refused to come into focus. Ava rubbed her aching head, soothing her temples with her fingertips. She really needed to get her head on straight. That need only grew when she caught herself looking back up the height of the cream-rendered building to the floor where his apartment was, harboring a ridiculous hope that he would be leaning out of his window, framed by the green shutters and watching her. Damn him. Damn Benares, too, for messing with her head and throwing her life into turmoil. Ava turned her back on the elegant old building and charted a course towards a main road, hoping she would find a taxi there. She was a long way from her own apartment, across the other side of the city in an area that had money stamped all over it. Her Mark had to be good at his job to earn enough money to live in such a fancy area. She ignored the whispered urge to look back the way she had come. She was never going to see him again. That was final. She valued her life. The main road was quiet, still in the early morning, and she strolled along it, desperately trying to shut out her thoughts about her Mark and what they had shared. He had been so different with her. Intense, passionate, full of emotion. He had been a complete contradiction to the man she had tailed, blowing all of her research apart in one wild, explosive moment together. She managed to hail a taxi, regaining awareness of the world for as long as it took to give the driver directions to her apartment, and then losing herself in her thoughts. She mulled over everything, trying to piece her Mark together but failing dismally. Maybe it had been the drug. It had affected them both. She came out of her thoughts again as the taxi rattled over the cobblestones and pulled up outside her apartment building in a small square. She handed the driver his money, stepped out of the cab, and walked up the gentle slope towards the entrance to the pale gray rendered building. She punched in the code to unlock the smaller rectangular door set into the large arched wooden double doors. It clicked and she pushed it open and stepped over the threshold, into the cold, shadowy, broad tunnel that joined the square to the courtyard of the building. It was quiet. Ava ran through her normal checks, halting in the shadows to scour every inch of the courtyard, from her yellow Ferrari, black Maserati, and white Fiat 500 in the center of it, to the covered walkway that ran around the four sides where the ground floor of the four-story building had been set back to provide shelter. She shifted left and right to see past the arches and columns that supported the upper 3 floors of the building, making sure no one was hiding behind them. Satisfied she was alone on the ground floor, she scanned the dark windows of the upper floors. No sign of movement there, and none of the alarms hidden around the courtyard had been triggered. She flipped a silver panel on the right-hand wall of the tunnel down, punched in another code to turn off the motion sensors, and then flicked the panel closed again. Normally, she would turn on the lights in the courtyard when returning home, but not today. Today she wanted to get in and out unseen, so she stuck to the shadows in the covered walkway, heading to the opposite side of the building. She would pack a bag and get away from Rome, away from the madness of Benares and her Mark. Maybe she could even use some of her contacts to help her. Plenty of them owed her a favor, and she was sure some of them could hold their own against Benares. She unlocked the door to the building and quickly moved up through the silent levels. Or maybe she could kill him herself. Security would be a problem, but there was a chance she could slip into his villa while he was sleeping and take him out. Ava almost laughed at herself for even considering it. She reached the floor she had chosen to live on in the building. Her building. It had cost her a small fortune, but it was better than sharing one with others. She wasn't sure how her Mark did it. How could he live surrounded by so many people? She paused at the door to her top-floor apartment. Or did he live alone in his building just as she lived alone in hers? She racked her brain, trying to remember whether she had seen or heard anyone when she had been leaving his building. She hadn't. Ava shook her head. It had been early, barely dawn. It was possible everyone in the apartments had been asleep, or she had missed hearing them because she had been so preoccupied with getting away from him after he had kicked her out. Kicked her out. It felt as if he had done just that if she had acted differently he would have kept her around, even when he knew she had been hired to kill him, or whatever Benares had hired her to do. She pushed the solid metal door open and stepped into her apartment. A quick scan revealed everything was right where she had left it, and none of the motion sensors had been triggered. Good. Ava turned to close the door, and almost jumped out of her skin. Jen curled a crimson-painted lip at her surroundings. How the hell had her client found her? No one knew where she lived. She had made sure of that, had covered her trail relentlessly, ensuring that her base of operations remained hidden from her clients. Yet Jin was standing on her doorstep, looking for all the world as if she wished she wasn't. "You did well," Jin said, coldness in her British accent that had Ava wondering whether she was being sarcastic or whether everything really had gone as Benares had planned last night. Ava ran a glance over the woman and frowned. Combat fatigues. The black long-sleeve roll-neck top hugged her incredible figure, and tight trousers had been tucked into rubber-soled leather boots. Even her blonde hair had been tied back into a neat ponytail. Why was her client dressed as if she was going on a special ops mission? It dawned on Ava as she spotted something sticking out of the woman's pocket, something that resembled a balaclava. There was a reason Jin had known where she lived, and had known the moment she had returned to her apartment. Jin was the one following her, reporting her every action to Benares. She had tailed Ava to the square last night, and from there to her Mark's apartment, and she had seen her leave this morning and had followed her to her apartment building. Ava curled her fingers into fists at her sides and cursed herself, and her Mark, too. It was his fault she had failed to notice her tail this morning. She had been too preoccupied with thoughts of him. Stronzo. Damn him to hell. How much did Jin know, and how much was she piecing together from Ava's appearance? She was dressed in her Mark's clothing, after all. She huffed and cursed again. She should have squeezed back into her damp things. Her shoulders sagged a little. It wouldn't have changed anything. She had still been spotted leaving his apartment building in the morning after she had been there all night. Her eyes widened in horror. The windows, rooftops, a groan escaped her. Just how much had Jin seen? Ava wanted to bury her head in her hands and scream in frustration. Instead, she tipped her chin up and rolled her right shoulder as casually as she could manage. "I was just doing my job." It sickened her to say that when in part it was the truth. She knew without a doubt now that Benares had hired her to seduce his target, her Mark. Her stomach rolled, but she held her shit together. "We want you to go to Valen one more time." Anger laced her as those words reached her ears, making her blood come to a boil in her veins. No damn way. She knew exactly what that meant. She was done with this job. She was done with Benares and Jin and her Mark. Valen. Was that his name? In all the months she had been working the job, she had never uncovered it. Wherever he went, he used a different name. So many that she had grown tired of asking people what it was and had settled for leaving it a mystery. What had he done to deserve Benares coming after him like this? Why was it so important to Benares that she continued to seduce him? The greater part of her wanted to tell Jin to go to hell, but there was a small piece of her that wanted to question the woman so she could learn why Benares had hired her and could uncover his endgame. That desire disappeared with a sharp pop as Jin leaned towards her, blue eyes eerily bright in the dim light, and smiled. "You enjoyed it, didn't you?" Ava scowled at her. "No, I've done my part. I've done what you asked. I'm an assassin, not a whore. This isn't what I do, so I'm done. Understand?" Jin sighed and leaned back. "Benares will be disappointed. He does not like it when people renege on a contract with him." Ava held her ground, planting her hands on her hips and keeping the frown on her face, hiding the sudden spike of nerves that shot through her, together with images of her lying in a ditch somewhere, beaten and dead. "I'm not reneging on anything. Benares withheld information from me, something I don't like, and I did what he asked. I got intelligence on this Valen character for him. I did what I was hired to do." Jin's smile turned cruel. "I do not recall your contract stating what it was my brother had hired you to do." Brother? Ava's mouth flapped open and she quickly snapped it shut. Benares was Jin's brother? Her stomach turned again, revulsion churning it this time as she caught a flash of the way Jin looked at him, desire written plainly across her face. What sort of sick relationship was happening in that mansion? She barely suppressed a shudder that went through her. On the heel of a deep desire to vomit came a realization that rocked her to her core. The demented bitch was right. Her contract with Benares didn't state what it was she had been hired to do. None of her contracts did. It was hardly sensible to put in writing that she was going to kill someone. Damn. She should have been specific this time, though, since Benares had only hired her to gather information on Valen. Now she was trapped by her own damn contract and stupidity. "So you will do as Benares desires?" Jin moved closer, that twisted smile holding, a glimmer of satisfaction in her blue eyes that told Ava she liked seeing her squirm. Why? Because her brother had a twisted thing of his own for her? Did Benares even want her to sleep with Valen again? A voice at the back of her mind whispered that it was probably Jin who wanted to see it happen, that the woman had a motive of her own and it was born of jealousy, which had grown into a desire to ruin her in her brother's eyes so he would no longer want her. Both of them were sick. "If I do this, I'm done," she said, going against every instinct that screamed at her to slam the door in Jin's face, pack a bag, and run as far as she could before she was pulled deeper into their twisted world and whatever game they were playing. Jin nodded. "If you get the result we desire, then yes, your contract will be fulfilled." The result they desire. That was just another way of saying she wouldn't be done, that Benares wouldn't release her from her contract and he would keep changing the rules, using her in whatever way he saw fit. She would never escape them. But running wasn't the answer either. Benares would find her. There was only one way to be free of him. She bit back a smile as a plan came to her, one that was dangerous but might be her only shot at saving herself. She was going to play her mark against her client. Chapter 6. Valen glared down at Rome, watching it flicker from the present to the possible future between lightning strikes. Black clouds boiled overhead, the rain cold on the nape of his neck as it hammered down, turning the grass beneath his backside to mud. Ava. Another white-purple bolt lit up the sky and ravaged the earth, tearing it up just 20 meters to his left and shaking the hillside. He growled through clenched teeth, fury mingling with hatred in his veins, tangling together so tightly they sucked all his other useless emotions into the black hole they created. Valen let them go willingly, didn't give a flying fuck about anything as the rain poured down on him, and his beautiful lightning ripped apart the sky and shook the ground. The storm raged before his eyes as fiercely as it raged within him, savaging everything in its path, so violent that it was bound to draw attention from Mount Olympus. He didn't give a fuck about that either. He shoved onto his feet and raised his face to the sky, held his arms out at his sides and let the storm build within him, coaxed it and fed it, pushed it to its limit. Lightning struck all around him, the thunder so loud it hurt his ears, and car alarms screamed in the distance. Each rapid strike only served to fuel the fury mounting inside him, and in turn it served to quieten the pain. Power raced along his bones, through his veins, and lit up his nerves. He embraced it and let it flow through him, let it carry him away in the hope it would burn everything in its path, all of his feelings, his memories, her. The rain grew heavier, pelting him like shards of ice, but still he didn't move. He kept feeding the storm, even when he could feel the fear in the air, hear the terror of the mortals far below in the city, a city he had vowed to protect. That made him want to stop, but he couldn't now. He couldn't. Not until the storm had burned away whatever this fucking idiotic feeling was inside him. This feeling that shouldn't exist. This weakness. Another flash of Ava denying she had slept with him tore a scream from his throat and had lightning striking hard all around him. The smell of earth and ozone flooded the chilly air, but it didn't comfort him today. Not when her words taunted him. She would never fuck a mark. She would never sleep with him. He knew what she had been trying to say. She had driven her point home hard enough that it had pierced his chest, but hadn't quite hit its mark. Valen finished for her, hammering it into his own stupid head. She wouldn't fuck a mark, meaning something without feeling, something detached and methodical. Fair enough. She wouldn't sleep with him, meaning she felt no desire for him, was repulsed by him, would never even consider him whether he was or wasn't her mark. He laughed at that, but it was a broken, hollow sound, one that only stoked the fury in his veins until it blazed so hot he couldn't control it. He snarled and snapped his head down towards his city at the same time as he brought his hands forwards. Lightning struck across Rome, hitting every single one of the 200-plus rods he had painstakingly placed on the buildings to protect them. The entire city shook from the force of the blow. He didn't give a damn what she thought. It bounced off him just as the rain did, washing from his body and rolling away from him. His power rose again, another bolt charging, making his blood hum and bones warm. Gods, it felt good. It was beautiful. The only beauty he needed in his dark world. There was nothing as addictive as his power, nothing as seductive, nothing as pleasurable. It was all he needed. It was all he would ever need. He pressed his middle finger and thumb together in front of him and clicked. The lightning rushed to obey him, a white-purple blaze shooting from the black sky to split and split again, creating a branching pattern above the city before each tiny fork connected and the earth responded, sending electricity racing up the branches and thickening them as thunder boomed across Rome. The other world flashed over the city, a vision of fire and horror, filled with the screams of mortals and the choking stench of death. It was growing worse again. He needed to deal with the assassin, and whoever had sent her. It was the only way to restore some balance to Rome and the world, and stop the other world from looking so crappy. But to do that, he would have to see her again. He growled and raised his hand to conduct another lightning strike, and snarled again when his hand shook, weakness invading his body and making it difficult to move his fingers. He had pushed too hard again, had let his power take too much from him. He lowered his hands to in front of him and stared at his upturned palms. They trembled violently, and he struggled to form fists, fighting the cold ache that started in them and seemed to travel through his body, sweeping the last of his strength away. Fuck. He threw his head back and roared at the sky, unleashing his anger in the only way he had left. Fury at himself this time. He shouldn't have gone all out. He had a city to protect, and he was no use to it if he couldn't use his power. Valen looked down at Rome, barely able to see it through the haze of the rain, a city he had just terrified. He sank to his knees on the slick grass and let the storm fade, let it all flow out of him and calm replace it, filling him up and stealing away his emotions. The rain lightened and then gradually stopped, revealing the city to him. Relief swept through him. It was fine, still in one piece, which was more than he could say for himself. The black clouds parted, allowing the sun to shine through and hit his back. It instantly warmed him, as soft and comforting as a caress, and he sat on his knees and let it soothe him and chase away the cold. When his hands stopped shaking, his bones no longer trembling, he pushed back onto his feet and trudged down the slick hillside towards the distant road, skidding in places and having to fight to retain his balance. His punishment for using too much of his power. He was going to have to walk all the way back to his apartment, a distance of at least 5 miles. He couldn't even step that tiny distance now. What use was he to his city when he was like this? No use at all. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his black jeans and huffed as his soaked black t-shirt tugged against his skin, irritating him. He hadn't wanted to bring his coat, even when he had known it was going to end up pissing down on him. It smelled of her. By the time he reached the city outskirts, his feet were sore in his boots, souring his mood further. He cursed Ava's name with each step, and that only dragged his mood deeper into a dark mire. His brothers were right. He needed to deal with her. At the very least, he had to locate her and bring her to his brothers so they could question her. He growled at that thought. He didn't want Karis anywhere near her. She would probably fall head over heels for the bastard. She was his. He laughed under his breath at that and hardened his heart again, pushing her out of it as he turned a corner. The scent of lilies hit him. That heart softened to mush. Valen froze and dragged his eyes away from the pavement, fixing them on the woman standing before him in the alley, shadowed by the elegant buildings that surrounded her. A ray of light in the darkness of his world. She held her slender, pale hand out to him, her smile lighting up her face as it curved her soft, shell-pink lips. Her luminous green eyes sparkled with love and understanding, a stunning contrast to the earthy red of her wavy hair that curled around her bare shoulders and brushed the black layers of her corseted dress. Valen went to her as she desired, unable to refuse her. She carefully lifted her hand and smoothed her palm across his cheek.
I felt your anger and your hurt, and Hades gave me leave to see you.
Her melodic voice danced around him, as comforting as an embrace from her would have been, and he sank into it and let it push all of his heavy thoughts away, replacing them with only her. He had figured Mount Olympus would feel his fury. He hadn't banked on his father feeling it all the way in the Underworld, too.
Can we go to your home to speak?
He instantly shook his head, his insides growing heavy and dragging him back down. He didn't want to take her there because he wasn't ready to face it yet. He didn't want to think about Ava right now.
To another place?
Persephone said with a bright spark of hope in her soft voice, and he nodded.
I know somewhere.
It was hardly suitable for her, but it was nearby, and it would hopefully be quiet at such an early hour. The sun was still peeking above the horizon, not quite ready to bid good night to Rome. His mother nodded, and the fact she had come to him again sank in as he led her through the streets, struggling to stop himself from growling at every male who looked at her. She was off limits. He would kill anyone who even thought about speaking with her, let alone looked as if they might try it. He turned down another smaller alley a short distance from the Pantheon and pushed a plain metal door open, holding it for her. She thanked him with a gentle smile and stepped inside, and he grimaced as he noticed she was barefoot. At least flowers weren't sprouting around her feet as they normally did. He glanced back along the street in the direction they had come, relieved to see she hadn't left a trail of blooms in her wake. Valen followed her into the building and up the concrete steps to the bar. It was mercifully quiet, with only a few people hanging out at the round tables and the long black bar. The female bartender, a slight brunette, nodded at him, and he led his mother to a booth in the corner of the room, away from everyone else. She eased down onto the padded black leather. Gods, she couldn't look more out of place. She would have been more at home in Heavenly Body, his favorite club, because Hellspawn frequented that place. But it never opened until darkness had fallen. This bar opened throughout the daylight hours, too, and the downside to that was the fact it only attracted mortals, which only seemed to trigger a response in his mother that made her seem even more out of place. Her bright green eyes darted around, taking everything in, abject fascination shining in them. When the mortal female came for their order, he thought for a moment that his mother would start questioning her, her excitement about being out in the world and surrounded by humans too much for her to contain. She didn't get out much. Her deal with her mother and her role as a goddess meant she was allowed to leave the underworld from spring to summer. But since having Karis, she had turned into a stay-at-home mum and rarely left her husband's side. Hades was a jealous and possessive bastard. It ran in the blood. Valen was surprised he had allowed Persephone to come to him.
Why are we not at your home?
She whispered, and reached across the round black table to him. He sighed. I just don't feel like being there right now.
Is the reason you tried to destroy Rome the same reason you will not go home?
That's a little harsh, he snapped, and then regretted it when her fine dark eyebrows pinched together and she sat back, distancing herself. He huffed. Rome is still in one piece.
Is it the female?
He folded his arms across his damp chest. No way he was going to answer that. Her small smile said she already knew the answer anyway. The bartender arrived with his drink and another one for his mother. He waited for her to leave, watching his mother closely so she didn't surrender to her urge to question the mortal. Persephone's brow crinkled as she eyed her drink. "It's just juice." He stirred the colorful plastic stick in his, mixing the grenadine with the fruit juices and causing the ice to clink against the sides of the tall glass. "It looks better than drinking water." Since he wasn't allowed to drink booze like a normal person, his brothers preferred water. Water was boring, but then so were his brothers. "Dad got over Ares dating a carrier yet?" Valen was sure that was going to go down well with their father. Megan was barely one step away from a demon, the only difference being her power to heal came from Hellspawn ancestry, one of the breeds that Hades deemed all right. There were plenty of mortals out there like her who had dormant powers that came from demon blood, though. And if Megan had been from one of those families, Hades would have flipped his shit.
"I am not here to speak about Ares and Megan."
The fact that his mother was allowed to use her name, and that she said it in such a warm way, went a long way towards telling Valen that Hades was already getting used to Megan being involved with Ares. Boring.
"Tell me about the female."
He really didn't want to do that, but his mother was giving him that look that said she wasn't going to leave until he confessed everything. Or at least something. No way he was telling her everything. There were some things his mother didn't need to know about him. "You were wrong about her name." Could he leave it at that? It struck him that he was fishing, and that had him pissed all over again. Hadn't he decided to capture Ava, hand her over to his brothers, and forget about her? Persephone smiled at him over the rim of her glass.
"I was not."
He casually leaned back into the leather seat and toyed with the stir in his drink. "Were too. She's called Ava. That isn't the name of an angel."
"Evangelina."
Valen's stomach dropped, plummeting to the depths of the underworld, and his heart gave a hard beat against his chest. Evangelina. It certainly sounded heavenly to him. Sweet gods, he could easily imagine whispering it against her neck, pleading her to have mercy on him. His senses lit up, sending a shower of sparks skittering through him, and his eyes drifted to the door as the lights there stuttered. His breath left him in a rush as he recognized the wicked curves of the woman before she stepped into the lights of the bar, flooding him with the same fierce hunger he had experienced last night in her arms, and the scent of roses and sin hit him with the force of a tidal wave. Evangelina. His angel.